The pack mocked the Omega for planting trees around her cabin, until winter made them a stronghold. Maya pulled the third shovel out of the back of her truck before the morning light had fully settled over the valley. The ground was still half frozen along the edges, and her breath came out in small white clouds as she drove the blade into the earth and put her weight behind it. She had been up since 4. She had drawn the layout the night before. Circles within circles, spacing noted in pencil on graph paper, and she was not wasting another hour getting started. Holt Pierce saw her from the road. He had been driving his truck down the main gravel track that split their properties when he slowed and leaned out the window. She did not look up. He watched her for a moment, then drove on. She heard his engine fade and the crunch of gravel go quiet, and she kept digging. The valley where Maya Reese had built her cabin sat in a wide bowl between two ridgelines, in a part of the country where the winters came down hard and the summers were dry and golden. It was the kind of place where people had been living and working the same land for 2 or 3 generations, and where newcomers were tolerated, but rarely fully accepted. Maya had arrived 6 years ago, alone, with a truck full of tools and a plot of land she had purchased outright. She built her own cabin over the course of 2 springs, working on weekends and evenings until she could move in. By the time the community understood what she was doing, she was already doing it. She was 43 years old. She had the kind of face that looked calm even when she was thinking hard, and people sometimes mistook that for emptiness. She was not empty. She was simply someone who saw no point in explaining herself until the explanation was ready to stand on its own. The cabin sat on 5 acres at the eastern edge of the valley, where the land flattened out before it met the rising slope of the ridge. It was a good spot for a building, but a difficult one for winter. The wind that came off the high ground to the north hit that flat stretch with nothing to slow it down. In her first winter, Maya had watched the snow come sideways across her yard and felt the walls of her cabin shiver in the gusts, and she had sat at her kitchen table with a cup of coffee and thought about what she was going to do about it. What she did was read. She ordered books through the county library that had not been checked out in years. She pulled up research papers on her laptop, printed the ones she wanted to keep, and filed them in binders she labeled in her careful handwriting. She studied wind patterns, soil composition, native species charts, and the growth rates of every tree that could survive in her climate. She made notes in the margins. She drew diagrams. She measured the angles of prevailing wind on her property with a simple windsock she hung from a post at each corner of the yard, and checked every morning for 2 weeks. When she had collected enough information, she drew the plan that would sit in her kitchen drawer all winter, until the ground softened enough to begin. The community of Callaway Flats had approximately 260 people, spread across farms and homesteads, and a small town center, with a post office, a feed store, a diner, and a volunteer fire station. The Pierce family had been there the longest. Holt Pierce was 58, broad-shouldered, and had the particular confidence of a man who had never once been seriously wrong in front of his neighbors. He ran a beef cattle operation on the 200 acres that bordered Maya's property to the north and west, and he was the kind of man who expressed opinions the way other people expressed facts. His wife Donna ran the diner. Their daughter Faye worked the front desk at the county extension office. The Pierce name was everywhere in Callaway Flats in the way that long roots go everywhere under old ground. Maya knew who Holt was. She had been civil to him since she arrived. He had been civil back, in the way a large dog is civil to a small one, with a looseness that says it could change at any moment. She had heard through the particular grapevine that runs through small communities that Holt had once referred to her cabin as the squatter shack, and that he had told someone at the feed store that the woman out east was one of those types who moved to the country to play at farming without knowing a thing about it. She had heard this and gone home and continued reading her books. On the morning she began planting, she had 32 bare root saplings in the bed of her truck, wrapped in damp burlap, ordered 3 weeks earlier from a native nursery 2 counties over. She had also purchased 104 starts of hawthorn hedge from the same supplier, and they were stacked in bundles along her fence line, waiting. The total cost had been more than she had initially planned, but she had budgeted for it through the winter, setting aside a portion of her salary from the remote consulting work she did on her laptop. She was a land use analyst by training. She understood the relationship between investment and return. She understood it very well. She worked through the morning without stopping. She had mapped the positions of each hole before she drove the first shovel in. and she moved from marker to marker, with a steadiness that was not hurried but never wasted a single motion. The first ring of trees would go in 30 feet from the cabin walls on the northern and western exposures, spruce and balsam fir, the ones that would grow fastest and densest. The second ring, further out, would be a mix of pine and cedar. The outer edge, running along the fence line itself, would be the hawthorn, a tight, thorned wall that would eventually become impenetrable to both wind and animals. By noon, she had set 12 trees. Her shoulders ached. She sat on the tailgate of her truck and ate a sandwich and drank water and looked at what she had done. The saplings were thin. They were barely knee-high. Against the wide, flat expanse of her property, they looked like the kind of thing a child might plant in a school project. She looked at them for a while without any expression. Then she folded up her lunch bag and went back to work. Holt came back past on his way to the feed store at around 2 in the afternoon. This time he slowed and stopped. He got out and walked to the fence with his thumbs hooked in his front pockets, which was a posture Maya had already identified as his signature position for when he was about to say something he thought was clever. "You planting a garden?" he called. She was on her knees filling soil back around the base of a young spruce. She looked up. "Trees," she said. He looked at the saplings. He made no effort to hide his expression. "Those little sticks?" She went back to tamping the soil. "They won't always be little." He stood there another moment. "You know the frost goes down 3 feet here in February. Half those things are going to die." "I know the frost depth," she said. He laughed. But it was the kind of laugh that has nothing to do with amusement. It was the kind of laugh that establishes a ranking. He got back in his truck and drove off, and she heard him go, and she put another shovelful of amended soil around the roots of the next tree and moved on. What Holt did not know, what none of them knew, was that Maya had chosen every species on that list with a precision that would have surprised most professional foresters. She had cross-referenced growth rate data with her valley's specific climate zone, choosing varieties that were not just cold-hardy, but had been documented as performing well in exposed ridge-bottom conditions at this elevation. She had selected the hawthorn for 3 reasons: its density, its growth speed, and the fact that a mature hawthorn hedge in its 4th or 5th year develops a thorn structure so interlocking and tight that even heavy wind cannot find purchase against it. She had selected the balsam fir because it held its lower branches closer to the ground than other conifers, meaning the wind barrier would begin at soil level rather than 3 or 4 feet up, which is where most windbreaks fail. She had thought about this the way a chess player thinks about the board, not move by move, but end state first, working backward. By the time the sun dropped below the western ridge, and the cold came back in across the flat, she had planted 19 trees and set the first 40 hawthorn starts along the northern fence line. She loaded her empty burlap sacks into the truck, cleaned her tools, and went inside. Her hands were stiff and her back was tight, and she stood at the kitchen sink for a long moment, looking out the window at the thin line of sticks she had put in the ground that day, silhouetted against the last of the light. They were small. She knew they were small. She also knew exactly what they would become, and when, and she was not in a hurry, because she had understood from the beginning that this was not a project for the season. It was a project for years. And she had years. The next morning, the neighbor on her south side, a retired teacher named Gerald Fitch, who grew a considerable vegetable garden every summer, and was generally kind, stopped by the fence to look. He did not mock her. He simply studied the young trees with the interested expression of someone who is genuinely curious about what they are seeing. "What kind of spruce?" he asked. "White spruce mostly," she said. "A few balsam fir mixed in on the north side." He nodded. "For wind?" "Yes." He looked at the line she had already planted, and then at the open ground where the rest of the rings would go. "Going all the way around?" "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. "That'll take some time to come in." 3 to 5 years to get meaningful density, she said. 6 or 7 to full effect. Gerald Fitch looked at her for a moment with an expression she could not quite place, and then he said, "Well, good luck with it," and he went back to his own yard. She watched him go. She appreciated that he had not laughed. That evening, she sat at the kitchen table with her graph paper and updated the planting map with what she had set that day. She tracked each tree: species, position, date planted, soil amendment used. She took photographs with her phone and filed them in a folder organized by date. She did this not because anyone would ever see it or care. She did it because she believed that the record of a thing mattered, even if only to the person who made it. Outside, in the thin spring dark, her trees stood in the ground. Cold air moved across the flat. The saplings barely moved. They were too small yet to catch much wind, too thin to hold it. But their roots were already working downward into the earth, reaching for water, finding their footing, beginning the slow, unstoppable work of becoming something that would last. Maya turned off the kitchen light and went to bed. She had another early start in the morning. She had more holes to dig, more roots to settle, more ground to tend. The valley was quiet. The stars were out above the ridge. She did not lie awake worrying about what Holt Pierce thought. She had never needed anyone's approval to know when she was right about something. And in this, perhaps more than anything else, she was different from the people around her. They measured their decisions by how they landed with others. They planted crops the way their fathers had, built fences the way the county had always built them, and looked at anything new with the particular suspicion of people who had not found the old ways wanting. Maya had grown up in places like this, and had learned early that the only defense against that kind of pressure was not argument, not explanation, not even quiet dignity. It was results. Results were the only language that closed the mouth of certainty. And results, she knew, required time. She closed her eyes. Outside, the valley settled into the deep silence of a spring night, and the saplings she had planted stood in their rows, small and unremarkable, and beginning. The nights that week were cold, in the way that early spring nights in the valley were always cold. Not the killing cold of January, but a reminder that the season had not fully committed to warmth yet. She kept the stove going low through the night, and woke at 5 each morning to check it, and add wood, and look out the window at the dark yard, where her saplings stood in the ground. She had chosen the timing of the planting with care. Bare rootstock needed to go in the ground while it was still dormant, before the leaves pushed, before the tree put its energy into above-ground growth, and the root system was not yet prepared to support that demand. Plant it too early, and you risked a late frost killing the new buds. Plant it too late and the tree was already working against you. She had watched the soil temperature for 2 weeks with a thermometer she pushed into the ground each morning, and she had placed her order with the nursery, based on the date the temperature held consistently above 40 degrees Fahrenheit at a 4-inch depth. She was not guessing. She was reading what the ground was telling her. There was a woman in the valley. Everyone in Callaway Flats knew her, though not everyone spoke well of her. Named May Braddock, who was 81 years old and had been gardening the same quarter-acre since before Holt Pierce was born. May grew vegetables and herbs, and a few fruit trees, and had opinions about all of them that were delivered with the uncompromising precision of someone who had been right about plants for 60 years and knew it. She came by Maya's fence on the Thursday of the first week, and stood there with her hands in the pockets of her canvas jacket and watched Maya work without saying anything for a full 5 minutes. Then she said, "White spruce?" "Yes," Maya said. "And balsam fir on the north inner ring." May nodded. "Fir holds its low branches. That's why I chose it," Maya said. May was quiet for another moment. "You know what you're doing," she said. It was not a question, and it was not a compliment in the conventional sense. It was simply an assessment from someone who made them accurately. She went back to her own property and said nothing further. Maya thought about this afterward. She thought about it because it was the first unreserved acknowledgement she had received in Callaway Flats from someone who had the knowledge to back it up. Helen Croft would come later. Peter from the forestry department would come later still. But May Braddock had looked at a woman in her yard with a shovel and some saplings and said, "You know what you're doing." And she had said it without hedging, and this had landed in Maya in a way she did not fully examine, because she did not fully need it, and was slightly surprised to find it mattering. She thought about Ruth, her old forester from the Ontario project, and how Ruth had had that same quality, of assessing work on its merits, and saying so directly, without softening and without inflation. It was a quality she valued above most others in people, because it meant what they said was reliable. A compliment from someone who gives compliments readily means almost nothing. A compliment from someone who gives them only when they are earned means everything. The week ended, and the first phase of planting was done, and the yard held 26 trees and 70 hawthorn starts, and the ground between them was settled and mulched and waiting for what came next. She stood on the porch in the last of the Friday light and looked at all of it and felt the weight of a good week's work in her shoulders and her hands, and she went inside to make dinner. and she slept that night without dreaming. The second week of planting brought company Maya had not asked for. Not friendly company. The kind that slows down on the road and watches and talks amongst itself. Holt Pierce came back with his son-in-law, a wide-faced man in his 30s named Dale Morrow, who worked on the Pierce cattle operation, and had adopted Holt's opinions the way a younger dog adopts the habits of the one it follows. They parked Holt's truck on the gravel road and leaned against the hood and watched her work. She was setting hawthorn starts along the fence line, placing each one 18 inches from the next, firming the roots in with her boot heel. She could hear them talking, low enough that the words were not clear, but the tone was. She knew the tone. After a while, Dale raised his voice enough to carry. "Those look like weeds," he said. "You planning to grow a weed farm?" She did not answer. She moved to the next position on her line and pushed the next start into the prepared trench. "Lady knows what she's doing," Holt said, and even from that distance she could hear the particular quality of sarcasm he put into the word knows. The two of them laughed. She heard the truck door open and close, and the engine start, and they drove off toward the center of town. She set 15 more hawthorn starts before she stopped for water. She drank half a bottle standing in the middle of her property, looking at the lines she had made. If she squinted, she could begin to see the shape of what it would become. That shape existed right now only in her mind and on her graph paper, but she was one of those people for whom a plan held in the mind had nearly the same solidity as a thing already built. She could see the mature trees as clearly as if they were already there, their branches locking together, the wind breaking apart before it reached her walls. The talk at the feed store that week was the kind of talk that small communities specialize in. Ray Tolbert, who ran the store and knew everything that happened within 12 miles, mentioned Maya's tree project to 3 separate customers by Thursday. The way he framed it was not cruel, exactly. Ray was not a cruel man, but it had the flavor of something amusing. The way small communities sometimes treat the eccentricities of their outliers as a form of local entertainment. He told people she was putting in some kind of forest around that cabin of hers. He said it with a small smile. People took the small smile home with them. By the following Saturday, a truck Maya did not recognize had slowed to look at her property twice. She had not invited the attention, and she did not respond to it. She kept her head down and her shovel moving. Gerald Fitch came by again, late on a Wednesday afternoon. He was carrying 2 cups of coffee, in a way that suggested he had thought about it before doing it, and he offered one to Maya over the fence without making too much of it. She accepted it. They stood on their respective sides of the fence and looked at the progress she had made. "How many in so far?" he asked. 26 trees and 70 hawthorn starts, she said. He looked at the northern fence line where the hawthorn was already showing a thin, continuous presence, still low, still bare-looking, with only their first small leaves beginning to push out. "How tall will the hawthorn get?" 12 to 15 feet eventually, she said. "At full growth, they'll be too thick to push a hand through." Gerald wrapped both hands around his coffee cup. "Holt's been saying you're wasting your money." She looked at him. "What do you think?" He considered that. Gerald Fitch was the kind of man who took questions seriously, rather than answering them on reflex. "I think I don't know enough about what you're doing to have an opinion yet," he said. "But I don't think you strike me as someone who does things without a reason." She nodded once. That was enough for her. Gerald went home. She finished the fence line and started on the second ring of conifers along the western exposure. The western side was important because the afternoon wind off the ridge came from that direction, and in winter, when it dropped in temperature and velocity, it hit the flat of her property hard enough to make the cabin creak. She had documented the creak. She had measured the wind speed at the western wall on several separate occasions, with a handheld anemometer. She knew exactly what she was dealing with, and exactly how much she needed to slow it down. By the end of the 3rd week, the pattern of comment at the post office had shifted slightly. It was no longer just amusement. There was something else beginning to mix into it. Not admiration, not yet, but a kind of waiting. People were watching to see what would happen, the way people watch something they expect to fail, but are not quite certain about. It was a small shift. Maya did not notice it because she was not watching for it. She was watching her trees. Faye Pierce, Holt's daughter, came into her father's diner one Tuesday evening when Maya was there eating a bowl of chili alone at the counter. Faye was 29, quick-talking, and had her father's confidence without his particular edge. She sat 2 stools away and ordered coffee. and looked at Maya sideways in a way that was almost friendly. "Dad says you're putting in a whole forest," Faye said. "A shelter belt," Maya said. Faye paused. "What's the difference?" "A shelter belt is designed for a specific purpose. Wind reduction, primarily. Temperature buffering. A forest is just what happens when you leave land alone long enough." She ate another spoonful of chili. "A shelter belt is planned. Every tree has a reason for being where it is." Faye seemed to find this more interesting than she expected to. She turned it over for a moment. "How long before it does anything?" "Already doing something," Maya said. "Every root that goes into the ground changes the soil structure. Every sapling that leaves out in the spring is slowing air movement by a small amount. The effect accumulates." She paused. "Year 3 is when you start to notice it. Year 5 is when it changes how the property feels." Faye stirred her coffee. She looked like she wanted to say something else, but was not sure whether saying it would sound like a concession. "Dad bet Dale a case of beer that your trees would all be dead by first frost." Maya set her spoon down carefully. "What did Dale say?" Faye smiled slightly. "He took the bet." Maya picked up her spoon again. "The trees will be fine," she said. She paid for her chili, put on her jacket, and went out to her truck. The evening was cool, and the sky above the ridge had the particular deep blue of a spring evening in the valley. She sat in her truck for a moment before starting the engine, not because she was troubled, but because she was thinking. She was thinking about what Faye had said, and about the way the conversation had gone, and about what it meant that Holt Pierce had made a bet about her trees. A bet meant interest. Interest meant watching. And watching, she had learned, was the first step toward seeing. She drove home on the gravel road with her window down. The air smelled like cold soil and pine. She pulled up to her cabin and stepped out and stood in the yard for a moment. In the thin evening light, the saplings she had planted were barely visible. "Just 6 against the sky," as Holt had said. She looked at them without urgency. The work the following week was harder because the ground on the southern exposure was denser with clay, and the shovel had to be driven with more force. She broke a sweat before 8 in the morning and kept it through the afternoon. She played the radio from her truck while she worked, a station that came in with the right kind of old country music for digging. Not the kind that demands your attention, just the kind that keeps company. She moved down her line of markers and the holes went in, and the trees went in and the soil went back, and she tamped it and moved on. On the Friday of that week, she had an experience she had been half expecting. 3 boys, maybe 14 or 15, came down the road on bicycles and stopped at the fence to look. One of them, the one with the loudest laugh, called out that she was talking to her sticks. She was not talking to her trees. She was simply measuring the spacing between them with a tape measure. But she understood that the image of a woman, alone in a yard full of small sticks, was the kind of image that invited comment from 14-year-olds. She looked at them. Not with anger, not with embarrassment, just with the direct, even attention of someone who has catalogued this kind of behavior long ago and has not been surprised by it since. "Do you know what a shelter belt is?" she asked. The loud one shrugged. "No." "Come back in 5 years," she said, "and I'll show you." They rode off. She went back to her measuring. But she thought about it afterward, about the particular quality of indifference that young people wear when they have learned it from the adults around them. Those boys had not invented the mockery. They had borrowed it. That was how things like that worked. The tone came from the top and fell down through the generations, the way water falls through rock, wearing the same grooves, deeper with every pass. What they did not know, and what she had come to understand clearly in the years she had spent studying land and weather and the long behavior of growing things, was that nature does not participate in the social rankings of the communities that live on top of it. It does not care who has the most acres, the loudest laugh, or the longest name in the valley. It cares about roots and depth and the slow accumulation of years. In that regard, she had always felt more at home in the logic of trees than in the logic of people. By the end of the month of planting, she had set 41 trees and 102 hawthorn starts. Her original plan called for 58 trees and 104 starts. She was close. She would finish the following weekend if the weather held. She took photographs each evening at the same time, from the same position at the corner of her porch, so the record would show the same light, the same angle, and only the change in the trees. She had started this from the first day. She did not know whether the photographs would ever matter to anyone. She took them anyway, because she believed in the discipline of documentation the way some people believe in prayer. Not because it changes what is happening, but because it is the right way to witness it. The last weekend of the planting month arrived clear and cold. A front had come through on Thursday and left a thin crust of late frost on the lower ground, and she found 2 of her youngest hawthorn starts looking stiff and pale when she went out in the morning. She knelt beside them and checked the stems and found them pliable at the base, not dead, only stressed. She added a layer of mulch around each one and moved on. She finished the final ring by Sunday afternoon. 104 hawthorn starts and 58 trees, set in the concentric pattern she had planned all winter, covering all 4 exposures with different densities, matched to the actual wind behavior of her property on each side. She drove the last stake in at 3 in the afternoon and stood back. The yard looked crowded in a way it had not before, not with anything visible, but with intention. She had filled it with a plan that was invisible to anyone who did not know what they were looking at. To anyone passing on the road, it still looked like a woman who had planted a lot of sticks around a small cabin in a large flat yard. The sticks were still just sticks. She knew what they were. She put her tools in the truck. She washed her hands at the outdoor spigot. She stood on the porch for a long time, as the afternoon light dropped toward the ridge and turned the valley gold, and she felt the particular satisfaction of someone who has done the thing they set out to do, and done it right, without help, and without anyone's approval. Inside, on the kitchen counter, Holt Pierce's bet was still working its way around the valley. Outside, in the ground, her trees were working their way toward the sky. One of those 2 things was going to win. She already knew which one. May Braddock appeared at the fence again, on the penultimate Saturday of that month. She had her canvas jacket on, and she was carrying a small, dense-looking bundle wrapped in newspaper that she set on the fence post when she arrived. Maya came over, and May unwrapped it to reveal 3 hawthorn cuttings, each one about a foot long, which May had taken from the old hedge at the back of her property, a hedge she had planted 30 years ago that had grown into the kind of structure that required a saw to get through. "These are from the same rootstock as a very tough plant," May said. "They came through every winter I've seen here. You can put them in at the south gate if you want something there." She paused. "They grow fast. Faster than nursery stock sometimes, because the genetics have already been selected by this climate." Maya took the cuttings. She thanked May. She planted them that afternoon at the south gate, exactly where May had suggested, and she noted in her planting record that these were local provenance hawthorn cuttings from May Braddock's hedge, propagated from 30-year-old rootstock that had adapted to this specific valley. This was something she had read about in her research, local provenance, the principle that plants grown from seed or cutting within a specific region carry, in their genetics, the accumulated adaptations of every winter, and every drought, and every specific condition of that place. Nursery stock from a supplier 2 counties over was good. Stock from a hedge that had survived every winter in this valley for 30 years was better. She thought about this as she planted May's cuttings in the ground beside her own nursery hawthorn. The difference would not be visible this year, or next year, but in 5 years, in 10, the cuttings from May's hedge might be doing things that the nursery stock was still working toward. There was a lesson in that, she thought. Not about hawthorn specifically, about the value of what grows from a place, through time, in the specific conditions of that place. It was hard to replicate in a catalog. You either had it or you didn't. She had it. She had come to this valley and dug her roots into its ground and stayed, and what she was building here was as local as anything in it. Not by birth, not by family name, but by commitment, and by time, and by the willingness to learn what this particular piece of ground needed, and to give it that. That was what roots were. Not where you came from, what you stayed for. She watered May's cuttings in, and marked their positions on her planting map. She noted their origin, the date, the soil depth, the amendment she had used. She photographed them from the same corner of the porch at the same time as she photographed everything else. The month ended. All 104 hawthorn starts and 58 trees were in the ground. The yard looked full of intention. She drove to the hardware store and bought 1 more bag of mulch for the south gate area and spread it that evening. And when she was done, she stood back and looked at the south gate with May's 3 cuttings in their mulched positions and felt something that was not quite pride, but was adjacent to it. The satisfaction of a thing begun properly. Summer in Callaway. Flats had a particular quality that people who had never lived in a valley could not quite understand. The heat pressed down from above and bounced back up from the pale dry ground, and by July, the whole flat stretch of the valley shimmered in the middle of the day. Water was the thing that mattered in summer. Who had it, how they got it, and how long it would hold. Maya had known this was coming. She had drilled her well the previous fall to a depth that made the well company raise an eyebrow, and she had installed a small holding tank behind the cabin. Through the first weeks of June, when the rains stopped and the sky turned white with heat, she began hauling water to her trees twice a week. 2 gallons per sapling, applied slowly to the base so the water had time to sink before it ran off. The hawthorn gets 1 gallon per start. Every morning she went out with her watering cans while the air was still cool, and she worked the rings methodically, tree by tree, start by start, until she reached the end and started a new day. It was not glamorous work. There was nothing about it that drew attention or admiration. It was just a woman, carrying water across dry ground in the early morning, doing a thing that needed doing. This was the part that the people of Callaway Flats found impossible to understand. By June, the trees were still ankle-high at best. The hawthorn starts had put on a few inches and were leafing out enough to show green along the fence line, but they were a long way from being a hedge of any substance. On the northern exposure, where Maya had planted the balsam fir in the first ring, the trees had each put out one new flush of growth from the terminal bud, the tight spring growth that looks like a small hand of needles bunched at the tip of each branch. She watched these new growths the way a parent watches a child take a first step. Each one told her the root system was established, the tree was drinking, the tree was alive. Holt Pierce drove past on his way to check cattle in the north pasture, and slowed at Maya's fence line as he had taken to doing. It had become a habit of his, a casual check-in on the progress of the project he expected to fail. This morning he saw Maya crouched at the base of one of her fir trees with a measuring tape. She was recording the new growth in her notebook. "How they doing?" he called. She looked up without expression. "Growing," she said. He looked at the trees. They were small. He looked at the hawthorn along the fence. It was thin. He looked at the whole operation, and the look on his face was the one he wore when something confirmed a thing he had already decided. "Well," he said, with a kind of rich, self-satisfied finality, "we'll see." He drove on. She wrote down her measurement and moved to the next tree. The summer became a test of a particular kind of commitment, not the dramatic kind, not the kind that has an audience or a moment of crisis. The ordinary kind, which is harder in some ways because no one sees it and nothing about it ever quite reaches a peak of intensity. It is just the daily choosing to do the thing, again and again, through heat and tired shoulders and the persistent low sound of skepticism that ran through the community like a current under water. Donna Pierce, Holt's wife, came into the conversation at the diner one afternoon in July, when Maya stopped in for lunch. Donna was a straightforward woman who had learned over 30 years of marriage to Holt to say what she thought, because not saying it had never once improved his behavior. She brought Maya's sandwich without being asked to, and set it down, and stood a moment. "Holt says your trees are all going to burn in this heat," she said. It was said plainly, not unkindly, in the way that a person passes along information from someone else without necessarily endorsing it. "They won't burn," Maya said. "Native species. They evolved in this climate." Donna looked at her. "You know about trees?" "I studied land use for 15 years, Maya said. "Trees are a large part of land use." Donna was quiet for a moment. She had the look of someone recalculating something. Then she said, "Holt didn't know that." "No," Maya said. "He didn't ask." Donna went back to the kitchen without further comment. Maya ate her sandwich and looked out the diner window at the main road through Callaway Flats. A truck went by with a load of hay. A dog crossed in the heat shimmer. Nothing moved fast in this valley in July. The following week brought a dry spell that hardened even the watered ground around her trees to a pale crust. She began deep watering, driving a pipe into the ground beside each sapling and letting water seep down slowly to the deeper roots, encouraging them to go further down rather than spreading near the surface where they would always be vulnerable. This was something she had read about in a research paper on drought resistance planting, a technique used in dryland reforestation projects in the American West. She adapted it to her scale, using a length of 3/4-inch pipe and a slow trickle. It took longer than surface watering. It was more effective. She was doing this on a Tuesday, when a car she did not recognize pulled onto the gravel road that ran along her northern fence. A woman got out, mid-50s, gray hair and a short practical cut, wearing clothes that said county office rather than farm. She stood at the fence and watched Maya work for a moment. Then she walked along the fence line, slowly, looking at the hawthorn starts and then at the conifers in their rings behind them. She did this without speaking, which Maya appreciated. Her name was Helen Croft. She had come from the County Agricultural Extension Office, which was the same office where Faye Pierce worked the front desk. But Helen was not Faye. Helen was a horticulture specialist who had been with the Extension Service for 22 years, and she had been told, by someone she did not name, that there was something interesting happening on the eastern edge of Callaway Flats. She looked at Maya's work for a long time before she spoke. When she did, the first thing she said was not a compliment or a criticism. It was a question. "What spacing did you use on the outer hawthorn?" 18 inches between centers, Maya said. Helen nodded slowly. "And the first ring of fir? What's your setback from the cabin wall?" 30 feet on the north and west, 35 on the south, to account for the summer shade angle. Helen looked up at that. The summer shade angle was not something that most people planting trees thought about. If you put your windbreak too close on the southern side, you lost winter sun to the cabin when you needed it for passive heating, while blocking a wind that came less often from that direction. Maya had calculated the sun angle for her latitude and adjusted the southern setback accordingly. "You've studied this," Helen said. It was not a question. "For 2 winters," Maya said. Helen walked the western fence line and looked at the young pines she had placed in the second ring. She knelt beside one and looked at the new growth and the root flare at the base. She stood up and brushed dirt from her knee and said, "These will be fine through the summer if you keep up the deep watering." "I know," Maya said, not unkindly, but directly. Helen looked at her with something that was almost a smile. "Who did you study under?" Maya told her about the reforestation project she had worked on in northern Ontario in her late 20s, 3 seasons with a team that was reclaiming disturbed land at the edge of a boreal forest. She had learned to read soil from a soil scientist who had spent 40 years in the field. She had learned species selection from a forester who had little patience for theory and great patience for practice. She had learned the particular relationship between wind and structure from watching, over 3 seasons, what happened to the land where the wind was blocked and what happened where it was not. Helen listened to all of this without interruption. When Maya finished, Helen said, "The community thinks you're doing something eccentric." "I know," Maya said. "Does that concern you?" Maya looked at the young trees in their rings. The hawthorn starting its slow thickening along the fence, the balsam fir with its tight new growth, the white spruce already showing a confidence in the way it held itself that the other trees were still working toward. "No," she said, "it doesn't." Helen left without making any promises, but she left in a way that felt like the beginning of something, and Maya noted that without putting too much weight on it. July passed. August arrived and deepened. The heat settled over the valley with the permanence of a guest who does not know when to leave. The grass on the flat went brown. The cattle on Holt's property stood under the single cottonwood in the north pasture corner and waited for evening. The valley baked and cracked and turned the dull gold of midsummer drought. Maya's trees did not die. This should not have been surprising. She had chosen them precisely because they were adapted to survive conditions like these. But it somehow was surprising to several people in Callaway Flats, who had been quietly expecting some form of failure. The hawthorn kept its leaves. The balsam fir kept its needles. The spruce went on putting up a new inch of growth at the tips of each branch, with the unhurried patience of something that knows it has time. Holt noticed. He said nothing about it directly, but Donna mentioned to Gerald Fitch's wife that Holt had been slower to stop at the fence lately. He still stopped. He still looked. But the comments had thinned out. Something in the sight of those trees, still alive, and still growing in the heat that had finished off the pasture grass, had put a small, unwanted question in his mind. He had not invited the question. He did not like it, but there it was. The days shortened. The light began to change from the white glare of summer to something cooler and lower. The first hint of autumn came in the night air, and in the morning, the valley sometimes held a faint smell of wood smoke from someone somewhere burning off brush. Maya looked at her trees in the changing light and made her notes and took her photographs and watered less as the ground began to cool and the trees slowed their growth, and put the last energy of the season into their roots, going deeper, finding their grip. This was the part that happened underground, invisible, the part that nobody saw and nobody talked about, and that mattered more than any of the visible growth above ground. The root systems of the trees she had planted were now, in this final push before dormancy, laying the foundation that would let them explode upward in the spring, with a speed that would make people blink. She knew that. She kept her own counsel about it. At the end of August, she found a note in her mailbox from Helen Croft at the extension office. It was short, written on county letterhead. It said that she had discussed Maya's project with a colleague who specialized in cold climate windbreak design, and that colleague would be interested in seeing the installation in person when the opportunity arose. Helen had added, at the bottom in her own handwriting, 2 words that Maya read twice. Nice work. She folded the note and put it in the binder where she kept her tree records, and she went back to her evening watering. The summer was almost done. The hard season was coming. She was ready for both. In late August, she had an experience that had not happened to her in Callaway Flats before. She was coming out of the diner, on a Thursday evening, when she passed 3 of the men who had been regulars at the diner for as long as she had been coming. Older men, farmers, people who had been in the valley their whole lives, and one of them, a man named Carl who ran a hay operation south of town, said her name and stopped. He said he had been watching her trees from the road. He said they were looking like something now. She said thank you. He said his father had put in a windbreak on the north side of the hay barn 40 years ago, a row of cottonwood and juniper, and it had saved the barn in 2 storms, and reduced his heating bill in the outbuildings enough that he had never forgotten it. He said he had not thought about windbreaks in 20 years, but watching hers had brought it back to him. She said she was glad it had. He nodded and went back to his coffee. She went to her truck. She sat in the truck for a moment. Something had shifted in that exchange, very slightly, in a direction she had not been tracking. Not the mockery softening. She had expected that eventually. Something else. The beginnings of a connection between what she was doing and what people here already knew from their own histories. The old relationship between this land and the people on it, which had known about windbreaks long before she arrived, was beginning to recognize what she had done as part of that same long knowledge. She drove home thinking about Carl's father, and the cottonwood, and the juniper. She thought about how knowledge like that moved through families and communities, through stories told at tables, through barns that had survived, and the ones that hadn't, through things her grandfather used to say about the wind on his place. And she thought about how that knowledge could also go quiet, could be set aside when the conditions were easy long enough, and how a generation could grow up without hearing it, and how it took something, a hard winter, or a woman planting trees by herself while people laughed, to wake it up again. She was not doing something new, she was doing something old, with more precision than it had been done before in this particular valley, in this particular installation. The principles were ancient. People had been putting trees between themselves and the wind since they first understood what the wind could do to them. She had simply applied those principles with the specificity of someone who had studied them formally, and tested them in the field, and brought all of that to bear on 5 acres of exposed flat ground, in a valley in the mountains. Helen Croft's colleague Peter had said it was one of the most thoughtfully designed residential windbreaks he had seen in this climate zone. Carl's father had planted cottonwood and juniper by knowledge passed down from people who had come before him and done the same. Different starting points, the same understanding. She pulled into her property lane. The headlights swept across the northern fence line and caught the hawthorn in their beam, now almost 4 feet high and dense along its full length, the late summer growth in full voice. She sat in the truck for a moment after she turned off the engine and looked at it. 3 more feet, she thought. The hedge needed 3 more feet to begin being what it was going to be. The inner ring needed another growing season and then 1 more. The middle ring was already filling the corridor. The pieces were moving in the right direction at the right pace. She got out of the truck. The evening was warm and dry, and the air smelled of dry grass and the faint mineral smell of the ridge. She stood in the yard in the dark for a moment, surrounded by her trees, invisible now in the night, but there, unmistakably there. And then she went inside to make her dinner. The summer was almost over. She had kept them alive through it. That was the job of a first summer, and she had done it. The thing about knowledge is that it is only powerful when it is applied. Maya had known this for most of her adult life. and she had learned it specifically about trees on a stretch of bare, disturbed land, at the edge of a boreal forest in northern Ontario, in a summer that had started badly, and ended in a way that changed what she understood about patience. She had been 27. She had graduated with a land use degree, and a reasonable amount of theoretical knowledge, and a hunger for something real to do with it. The reforestation project in Ontario was run by a provincial land trust, and funded by a combination of government grants and private conservation money. The lead forester on the project was a woman named Ruth, who was 61 years old and had the weathered look of someone who had spent 4 decades outdoors. Ruth had no patience for enthusiasm that was not paired with attention. She had told Maya on the first day that the land did not care how much she knew. The land cared what she did with it. Maya had planted trees that first summer, and made mistakes, and learned from them in the direct, physical way that outdoor work teaches, not by being told, but by watching what happened when you got it wrong, and when you got it right, and by understanding the difference so completely that it settled into your hands and your eyes, and stayed there. She learned species selection from the project's ecologist, a quiet man named Owen, who could look at a patch of disturbed ground and tell you in 4 minutes what it wanted to grow. She learned soil work from a soil scientist named Petra, who had spent a career studying what happened below the surface when root systems established themselves. She learned the wind from the land itself. The reforestation project ran 3 seasons, and by the end of the 3rd season, the section of land Maya had been responsible for was showing growth rates that exceeded the project's benchmarks. Ruth had noted this without excessive praise, which was its own kind of praise from her. Maya had filed the data in her records and come home and taken a job in land use consulting, and spent the next 12 years doing analysis for land trusts and municipalities, and occasionally for private landowners who needed to understand what their property was doing and what it could become. She was good at the work. She was also, in some fundamental way, waiting for a piece of land of her own where she could apply everything she had accumulated. The cabin in Callaway Flats was that land. The 5 acres of flat ground at the edge of the Eastern Valley was where all of it was going. Nobody in the valley knew any of this, not because she had hidden it, she had not hidden it, but because no one had asked. In Callaway Flats, you were understood by what you had, not by what you knew. What you had was acreage and cattle and equipment and a family name that had been there long enough to mean something. What you knew was secondary. What a quiet woman alone in a small cabin on the edge of the territory knew was, in the community's estimation, probably not much. This was a miscalculation. It was the kind of miscalculation that quiet people allow others to make, because correcting it requires explaining yourself, and explaining yourself suggests you need to be understood, and needing to be understood is a small surrender. Maya preferred to let people be wrong. The trees would explain. It was her Aunt Vera who pulled the story out of her, over coffee on a Saturday afternoon in early October. Vera was 70 and had been a plant biologist at a small college until she retired, and she was one of the few people in Maya's life who had never needed Maya to be less than she was. She drove up from the city twice a year, stayed a week each time, and treated the visits as what they were: 2 women who understood each other, sitting in a comfortable silence with occasional intervals of real conversation. Vera had walked the tree rings with Maya that morning, taking her time at each species, asking the questions that only someone who understood what she was looking at would think to ask. She had crouched at the base of the balsam fir and studied the root collar. She had looked at the interplanting pattern Maya had used in the 2nd ring, and then looked at the horizon to the northwest, working out in her mind the wind angles. "You set the hawthorn at the outer fence line for a reason," Vera said. It was not a question. "The hawthorn is the first barrier," Maya said. "It fragments the wind before it reaches the conifers. The conifers then redirect it up and over. By the time the air gets to the cabin walls, it has lost most of its force." Vera straightened up and looked at the arrangement as a whole. 3-layer system. 3 layers, Maya agreed. Hawthorn outer, mixed pine and cedar middle, balsam and spruce inner. Each layer is doing something different. The hawthorn breaks. The middle ring redirects. The inner ring buffers. It's a system, not just trees. They went inside for coffee, and Maya spread her graph paper on the kitchen table and showed Vera the original plan and the adjustments she had made based on the first growing season. The adjustments were small but deliberate. She had added 2 more balsam fir to the north inner ring after measuring the actual wind concentration in that corner with the anemometer, and she had shifted the spacing of the western pine by 2 feet, based on how the soil was draining after a heavy rain in May. Vera looked at the plan for a long time. You designed this? Yes. From your own work. From the project in Ontario. From the research I did that second winter. From everything I learned from Ruth and Owen and Petra, and from watching this property for 2 years before I planted anything. Vera was quiet. She held her coffee cup and looked out the window at the yard. The trees in the fading October light had the particular look of late autumn, when the leaves are mostly down and the structure of things is visible again. The bones of the hedge, the framework of branches, the shape of the planting pattern emerging clearly now that the summer growth had been stripped back. It looked, even now, like something that had been thought through. Does anyone here know? Vera asked. Helen Croft at the extension office has some idea, Maya said. Gerald next door may suspect more than he says. The rest of them think I planted a lot of sticks around my cabin, because I am the kind of person who does things like that. Vera looked at her. And that doesn't trouble you, should it? Vera thought about it. No, she said finally. I suppose not. The trees will tell them eventually. Maya nodded. She poured more coffee. Outside, the wind came down off the ridge with the first real edge of autumn in it, and the young balsam fir in the inner ring moved slightly, their branches flexing and recovering in the kind of easy, rooted movement that told you the root systems were deep and the trees were not worried. She had chosen the balsam fir for that quality in particular. Balsam fir holds its lower branches all the way down to the ground, unlike spruce, which loses its lower branches as it matures and leaves a gap below the main canopy. That low branching habit meant the wind could not come in under the tree the way it could with a mature spruce. It meant the wind barrier started at ground level. In a valley where the winter wind sometimes arrived on a nearly horizontal trajectory, that difference mattered enormously. Owen had taught her that. Owen, who had spent more time on his knees looking at the relationship between ground-level air movement and low-branching trees than most people spend on anything in their entire careers. He had a way of explaining things by showing you rather than telling you. He would crouch beside a mature balsam and a mature spruce in the same stand and show you the gap under the spruce and the solid wall under the balsam and say, quietly, see the difference? See what the wind does with each one? She saw it. She never forgot it. Vera left on Sunday afternoon, and Maya stood on the porch watching the car go down the gravel road and turn onto the main route and disappear. The valley was quiet, in the particular way it got quiet in October. A different quiet from summer or spring. Heavier and more settled. The cottonwood leaves along the drainage ditch had gone gold. The sky was the hard, clear blue of late autumn. She went back inside and sat at the kitchen table with her binders. She had 3 binders now. One for the original plan and research, one for the planting records, one for the growth data she was collecting season by season. She opened the growth data binder and entered the numbers from her most recent measurements. The balsam fir in the inner north ring had averaged 14 inches of new growth in the first season, which was at the high end of what she had projected. The hawthorn along the fence had put on between 8 and 12 inches, depending on position, with the north fence line showing the strongest growth because the prevailing wind had been stimulating the side branches to fill in faster, which was exactly what she wanted to happen. The pine in the middle ring was slower but solid, putting down root before height, which was the right order of priority for a tree in its first year in new ground. The numbers were not impressive to anyone who was looking for immediate results. But to Maya, they were exactly what they should be, and exactly what they predicted for year 2 and year 3 and beyond. The trajectory was clean, the plan was working. She closed the binder and sat for a moment with her hands flat on the table. Through the kitchen window she could see the north fence line, the hawthorn starting to show its characteristic form now, the dense twiggy structure that would thicken into something serious by next autumn. Beyond it, the first ring of balsam stood in the low afternoon light, catching a slant of gold that made them look older than they were. The mocking had not stopped, exactly. It had changed texture. Holt Pierce still drove past, and still looked. But the comments were less frequent now, less certain. There was a different quality to his attention, something that wanted to dismiss what it was seeing, but kept finding that what it was seeing did not easily cooperate with dismissal. She had noticed this change and said nothing about it to anyone. Ruth had told her once, at the end of the second season in Ontario, that the hardest thing about planting trees was not the physical work. It was the relationship with time. You had to make your decisions at the beginning, and then trust them, through years of uncertainty. Years when the evidence was thin, and the results were hidden underground, and the patience required was not the ordinary kind, but the deep kind. The kind that comes from understanding something so completely that you do not need the world to confirm it for you at every step. Maya had understood that then. She understood it now. The first frost arrived on the 14th of October, a thin silver coating on the ground that burned off by 9 in the morning. Her trees did not notice it. They had been preparing for it since August, shifting their energy from height to roots, hardening their tissue against the cold. They were ready. She went out and checked each one after the frost, all of them fine. She made a note in the binder. She put the binder back on the shelf. The winter was coming. She was not afraid of it. She had, after all, been building her defense for an entire growing season, and the defense was rooted, and alive, and exactly where it was supposed to be. Vera called from the city, the week after her visit. She did not call often. They were both people who preferred the unhurried pace of letters and the occasional long conversation to the ambient contact of frequent check-ins, but she called now, and Maya answered, and Vera said she had been thinking about the trees. She said she had been thinking about the hawthorn specifically, about how, in her career as a plant biologist, she had worked with hawthorn in 3 different research contexts, and in each one the plant had done something that the researchers had underestimated. It was not a glamorous plant. It did not have the height of a conifer or the beauty of a flowering cherry. It was thorned and dense, and moved slowly in its first years, and then, around year 3 or 4, something happened with its lateral branching that transformed it from a thin hedge into something that was genuinely difficult to look through, let alone move through. She had watched this happen each time with a kind of scientific pleasure. She said she thought Maya had made an excellent choice. Maya said she knew. Vera laughed. She said, "You always know. That's what makes you difficult to argue with." Maya said that Vera was the only person who tried to argue with her on fair terms, and that she appreciated it. They were quiet for a moment on the phone, the quiet of 2 people who have known each other long enough not to need to fill silence. Vera said, "I worry about you a little. Not about the trees, about the other part." Maya said, "Which part?" Vera said the part where you spend years doing something important alone, without credit, and whether that was a life that felt full to her, or only sufficient. Maya thought about this. She thought about it seriously, the way Vera's questions deserved to be thought about. She said she had thought about it before. She said that there was something that could look like loneliness from the outside, that was not loneliness from the inside, that living without the approval of others, and without their company, was not the same thing as being isolated. She said the work was real, and the results were real, and the knowledge she had brought to it was real, and those things did not require an audience to be true. Vera said she believed her. She said she just wanted to ask. Maya said she knew that too. After she hung up the phone, she sat at the table for a while. She thought about what Vera had asked, and about whether the answer she had given was entirely true, and she found that it was, almost entirely, and that the small part that was not entirely true was the part she was also not ready to examine too closely. The work was enough, the trees were enough, the knowledge was enough, and if there was a part of her that sometimes stood in the yard at dusk and felt the particular weight of evenings spent without company, she had learned to carry that weight without letting it alter the direction she was going. She had made the choice to be here. She had made it deliberately, with the same deliberateness she brought to everything else, and a deliberate choice, fully made, was something you did not revisit every time the night was quiet. She opened the back door and stood on the step and looked at the yard. The October evening was clear and cold. The trees in their rings were dark against the last light in the sky. The hawthorn along the fence had the dense, textured quality that it had begun to develop in its second autumn, the branch structure thickening into something that would be, by next year, the wall she had designed. She breathed the cold air. She went back inside. She had more measurements to enter in the binder before bed. The trees would be ready when the test came. She had never doubted it. She was less certain about everything else, but about this she was certain, and that certainty was enough to make the evenings manageable. The second spring broke early, with a warmth that rolled through the valley before the end of March, and the hawthorn along Maya's fence line leafed out 3 weeks ahead of anyone's expectations. She was standing at the kitchen window with her morning coffee when she saw the first real green beginning to show on the outer hedge, not the tentative flush of a single bud opening, but a wave of small leaves pushing out along the entire northern length, green and definite and fast. She set down the coffee and went outside in her coat and walked the fence line with her hands in her pockets and looked at what was happening. The hawthorn was not behaving like something in its second year. It was behaving like something that had been in the ground far longer, its root system so established after one full season that it was coming out of dormancy with force. She went back inside and wrote down the date and the observation. Then she went back outside and looked again, because some things deserve two looks. The trees in the inner rings showed the same pattern. The balsam fir that she had watched so carefully through the first summer were already pushing their new terminal buds 2 weeks earlier than they had the previous spring. The white spruce in the second ring were putting out their new growth with a vigor that was visible even from the road. The pine in the middle ring, which had spent its first year going down rather than up, was now going up, adding height in the particular fast, reaching way of a tree whose roots have finally found what they needed. Gerald Fitch came out of his back door one morning in the first week of April and saw it from 50 feet away. He stood at his fence line and looked for a long time. Then he walked the boundary between their properties, slowly, taking it in. He found Maya in the backyard doing measurements. "They came on fast," he said. "Second year is always the jump," she said. "The first year is the roots finding their footing. The second year is everything going up." He looked at the inner ring of balsam fir. They were visibly taller than the year before. Each tree had put on 8 to 14 inches over the winter's dormancy, and the spring flush was adding to that daily. How tall will they be by fall? "The balsam should clear 6 feet on the north side by September," she said. "The hawthorn on the fence will be 4 to 5 feet and starting to show some lateral fill." Gerald was quiet. He had a gardener's eye. He grew vegetables and knew what plants did when conditions were right and what they did when they were wrong. He was looking at plants that were in conditions that were right for them. He could see that. "Holt lost his bet," Gerald said. "The trees made it through winter." "I know," she said. "He didn't say anything about it." "I didn't expect him to." Gerald nodded once and went back to his own yard. He had the manner of a man who was rethinking something he had accepted without examination, and was doing the rethinking quietly, the way careful people do. The spring community meeting, held each April in the fire station meeting room, was the event where the business of Callaway Flats got aired. Fence line disputes, road maintenance, shared well agreements, who was responsible for the culvert at the north end of the main road. Maya attended because she had attended every year since moving in, not because she expected to be included, but because it was the right thing to do as a member of the community, even a peripheral one. She sat toward the back, listened, spoke when she was spoken to, and left when it was done. This year, near the end of the meeting, Dale Morrow brought up the subject of the wind damage that had taken out 2 fence sections on the Pierce property the previous winter. He was proposing a shared windbreak along the community's northern boundary, a line of trees, maybe 50 feet of hedge, to cut some of the wind that came off the ridge in January. He had heard, he said, that there were good options for this kind of thing. He looked at Maya when he said this, briefly, and then looked away. Nobody said her name. Nobody connected the proposal to the rings of trees growing behind her cabin, but the connection was in the room, quiet and unclaimed. Holt said nothing through the discussion. He sat with his arms folded and his hat on the table in front of him, and said nothing. When the meeting voted to table the windbreak question until the next session, he was the one who moved it, which was an odd move for a man who had started the conversation. Maya watched this and understood it. He did not want to have the windbreak discussion yet. He needed more time to not be wrong. She drove home from the meeting in the spring dark and turned onto her road, and her headlights swept across the front of her property. And for a moment, she could see the hawthorn hedge in the lights, fuller now, showing real structure, the interlocking branches already beginning the process of becoming what they would eventually be. A wall. Not a thin row of saplings, a wall. She went inside and made tea. She had a call the next morning with a land trust in the Pacific Northwest, who needed an analysis of a riparian buffer proposal, and she needed to review their documents before bed. She pulled up the files on her laptop and worked for 2 hours, and when she finally closed the laptop and went to stand at the kitchen window with the last of her tea, the yard outside was dark and still, and she could see the silhouettes of the inner ring of trees against the lighter darkness of the sky. 6 feet by September on the north side. That was what she had told Gerald. She was right. By the end of May, the balsam fir on the north inner ring was already clearing 5 feet and still going. She measured them every 2 weeks, and recorded the numbers, and photographed them, and updated her projection charts. The growth was tracking at the higher end of her models, which she attributed to the soil amendments she had put in the planting holes, and to the deep watering she had done through the first summer. Those deep roots were now proving their value, pulling water and nutrients from levels that the surface soil had lost during drought. Helen Croft came back in late May. She brought the colleague she had mentioned in her letter, a man named Peter who worked for the State Forestry Department and had spent a career studying cold climate windbreak installations. He was in his mid-50s, unhurried, the kind of person who moves slowly through things because he has learned that things reveal themselves to people who do not rush them. He walked the outer fence line first. He stopped at the hawthorn and looked at the branch density, looked at the spacing Maya had used, looked at the way the hedge was beginning to fill in from the sides, each plant extending its lateral branches to meet its neighbors. He made notes. He went into the middle ring and looked at the pine. He went into the inner ring and crouched at the base of one of the balsam fir and looked at the root collar and the low branch structure. He stood up and said, "The low branching selection on the inner ring was deliberate." "Yes," Maya said, "for ground-level wind sealing. The wind comes in nearly horizontal, off the north ridge in January," she said. "A standard spruce windbreak has a gap below the canopy. This doesn't." He looked at her for a moment. "Who taught you that?" "A field ecologist named Owen," she said. "On a reforestation project, and watching what happens to unprotected ground in January." He nodded. He walked the full perimeter, with Helen taking notes. He asked 5 more questions, all of them technical, all of them specific. She answered each one without hesitation. When they reached the starting point again, back at the northern fence gate, he turned and looked at the whole installation from the outside. The hawthorn, the middle ring behind it, the inner ring behind that, the cabin in the center, already showing in the way it sat within the rings, a quality that was different from the exposed buildings on the flat around it. "At full growth," he said, "this installation will reduce wind speed at the cabin walls by 50 to 60% on the north and west exposures, possibly more, depending on how dense the hawthorn fills in." He paused. "The hawthorn is filling in well." "I know," Maya said. He looked at her with the even, assessing look of someone who takes quality seriously and has found an unexpected instance of it. "This is one of the most thoughtfully designed residential windbreaks I have seen in this climate zone," he said. "The species selection, the layering, the setbacks, all of it is correct. More than correct, it's precise." She received this the way she received most things, without visible reaction, because the statement confirmed what she already knew, and what she already knew did not require confirmation to be true. Helen Croft made a note in her pad. "I'd like to include this in our extension service documentation," she said, "as a case study, if that's all right with you." Maya looked at both of them. "That's fine," she said. They drove away, and left her standing at her fence gate in the warm May afternoon, the hawthorn already above her waist, the balsam fir already above her head on the north side. She looked at it all for a moment. She thought about Peter's words, most thoughtfully designed residential windbreak he had seen in this climate zone. She filed this away in the same place she filed Holt's bet and Dale's sideways look at the community meeting, and the boys on bicycles, and the laughter at the feed store, and all the other things that had been said and done around this project since she began it. She filed it, and left it there, and went back to work. There were still things to do. The middle ring needed some additional mulching on the west side where the soil was drying faster than she liked. 2 of the hawthorn starts at the south corner had developed a slightly different growth pattern that she wanted to monitor, and she was considering, based on the growth data from the second spring, whether to add a 4th ring of shrub willows along the inside of the hawthorn on the northern exposure, to fill the zone between the hedge and the first line of trees, with something that would add mass and reduce the small turbulence she had measured forming in that corridor. It was the kind of decision that only mattered if you were thinking several years ahead. She was always thinking several years ahead. She could not help it. It was how she was built. Some people lived in the present, responding to what was directly in front of them. She lived partly in the future, seeing the shape of things before they arrived. And what she saw, In the late afternoon of that May, standing outside her gate with the hawthorn already thick enough to brush her fingers when she walked past it, was the winter that was coming 2 seasons from now. Not next winter, the one after. The one that the weather models she had been quietly following since the previous autumn were beginning to suggest might be something that the valley had not experienced in a very long time. She had not said anything about this to anyone. Not to Gerald, not to Vera. She was not certain enough yet to say anything. But she was watching. And the numbers she was watching had the look of something building. She went inside and pulled up her weather data files and looked at the pattern again. Then she went to her tree records and looked at her growth projections for year 3. The trees would be ready. She was sure of that. The question, still forming quietly at the back of her mind, was whether year 3 would be the year everything the trees were for would finally be tested. May Braddock came by one evening in late June, later than she usually appeared, when the sun was already close to the ridge, and the yard was in shadow except for the eastern end, where it caught the last light. She did not have anything in her hands this time. She stood at the fence and looked at the trees with the particular quality of attention that very old gardeners have, not admiring exactly, because admiration implies distance from something, and May had no distance from growing things. She looked at them the way she would have looked at her own plants. She said, "The balsam on the north inner ring. It's already holding its lower branches at a full horizontal." "Yes," Maya said. "That's good this early." May looked at the lowest branches, which were only 18 inches off the ground and already spreading to their full lateral reach, forming the ground-level seal that Maya had designed for. A lot of balsam fir, grown from nursery stock at lower elevation, doesn't do that in the second year. Takes 3 sometimes. The provenance was right, Maya said. The nursery sources from within the climate zone. May nodded. She looked along the inner ring. She said, "They'll seal the ground by next winter." "That's the plan," Maya said. May looked at her. She had small eyes that were extremely direct, the eyes of a person who had spent decades in close attention to small things and had developed a precision in her seeing that carried over into how she looked at people. "You're planning for a specific kind of winter," she said. Maya paused. "I'm planning for the worst kind," she said. "That's the only kind worth planning for." May was quiet for a moment. "My father used to say the same thing about barns," she said. "He'd say build it for the worst storm you can imagine, and then add 10%. She looked at the balsam fir. "He never lost a barn." She went home. Maya stood at the fence after May left, and thought about May's father and the barns and the 10%. And she thought about what she had built, and whether it qualified. She thought about the anemometer readings she had taken on the north wall over the past 2 winters. She thought about the weather data she had been following since July. She thought about the blocking pattern in the atmospheric models and what it suggested about the season ahead. She had designed for the worst case, but she had not designed for 10% beyond that. She thought about whether there was anything left to add. She walked the inner ring slowly, looking at the ground-level coverage. The balsam fir was, as May had said, holding its lower branches at full horizontal extension, but there were 2 gaps on the northwest corner, where adjacent trees had not yet grown their branches to meet each other. In a moderate wind year, those gaps were negligible. In a severe wind year, they could be the point where the air found its way through. She had willow whips left from the corridor plantings she had done in the spring. She had set them in the turbulence zone between the hedge and the first ring, but she had 10 surplus whips in pots beside the shed. She went and got 4 of them and planted them in the 2 gaps on the northwest corner, pressing them into the ground in the late evening light with her boot heel, firming the soil around each one. They were small, willows always were, but willows grew faster than anything else she had planted, and by next spring, those 4 additions might be 2 feet tall and beginning to close the gap. She made a note of the planting. She took a photograph. She went inside. She had done what she could. The rest was up to the ground and the time and the winter that was coming. The Regional Weather Service issued its long-range forecast in the first week of October, and the person who read it most carefully in Callaway Flats was not a farmer, not a rancher, and not anyone who made their living from the land. It was Maya Reese, sitting at her kitchen table at 6 in the morning, with her laptop open and a cup of coffee cooling beside her. She had been watching the models since July. She had a bookmark folder on her computer dedicated to climate data services, regional weather archives, and the long-range forecast products issued by the National Weather Service. She was not a meteorologist. But she was someone who paid close attention to patterns, and the pattern she had been tracking since summer was now showing up in the official forecast with the kind of clarity that meant it was no longer a possibility. It was a probability. The forecast said, an unusually severe winter season, driven by a persistent high-pressure blocking pattern over the western portion of the country, expected to produce sustained cold temperatures significantly below the historical average for the region, along with multiple high wind events and above-average snowfall, particularly in valley locations at elevation. It said this in the careful, qualified language that official forecasts use. What it meant, in plain terms, was that the winter coming was going to be serious. She read the forecast twice. Then she opened her tree growth data and looked at the third-year projections she had been updating through the second growing season. The balsam fir on the north inner ring were now averaging 9 feet and showing dense lateral branch coverage from ground level to crown. The hawthorn had reached 6 feet in the majority of positions along the fence line and had begun the thick interlocking growth in the upper half that would eventually make the hedge impenetrable. The middle ring of pine and cedar was 8 to 10 feet, and filling the gap between the hawthorn and the inner trees with a solid intermediate barrier. The shrub willows she had added in the gap on the north corridor were 4 feet and doing exactly what she had wanted, filling the turbulence zone, reducing the small pocket of wind acceleration that had been forming between the hedge and the first ring of trees. She looked at the forecast, and she looked at the tree data. She did not feel triumphant. She felt something quieter than that, a kind of focused readiness, the way a person feels when something they have been preparing for finally shows up on the horizon. She had not planted these trees because she knew a hard winter was coming. She had planted them because this kind of winter came eventually, to every valley, to every exposed piece of ground, sooner or later. She had just been planning for sooner. She closed her laptop and went out to walk the perimeter. The third-year hawthorn was extraordinary in October. It had the quality, up close, of something that had crossed a threshold. In the first year, it had been sticks. In the second year, it had been a thin living fence. Now, in the third autumn, it was a hedge. A real hedge. Dense and determined. The branches already so interlocked in the upper portion that her hand met resistance when she pushed it gently into the growth. The thorns were fully developed, long, hard, pointing in every direction the way hawthorn thorns do, making the hedge a structure that neither wind nor animal was going to move through easily. She walked the full perimeter slowly, touching branches, looking at the ground level density, looking at the canopy height. She went into the middle ring and stood in it and looked outward through the trees at the hawthorn and inward through the trees at the inner ring. The sensation was measurable. Inside the ring of trees, the air was quieter than outside the fence. Not still, she could still feel the October wind, but reduced, fragmented, its force broken into smaller currents that moved through the branches rather than across open ground. She had felt this beginning in the second autumn, and had measured it with her anemometer. Now the difference was large enough to feel without an instrument. In the center, around the cabin, the air was the quietest of all. She stood on her porch and looked out through the rings of trees at the surrounding valley. The Pierce property stretched away to the north, with its open pasture and single cottonwood. The fields on the south were open to the sky. The road to the west had nothing along it but the standard barbed wire fence. All of it was exposed. All of it sat in the full path of what the Weather Service had just told the region was coming. She went inside and made a list. Not a worry list. A preparation list. She calculated her firewood against the heating load reduction her windbreak would provide, and determined she had enough. She checked her larder. She looked at her generator fuel and topped off the storage tank. She checked her water supply and ensured her well pump had a backup heating cable in case the casing temperature dropped. She thought through every scenario the forecast suggested and matched each one with what she had done to prepare for it. And when she reached the end of the list, she could find only 2 things still to do. Order 1 more cord of wood as a buffer and install a second insulating layer on the north cabin wall. She ordered the wood that afternoon. She started on the insulation the following Saturday. She did not share the forecast with her neighbors. It was on the Regional Weather Service website, accessible to anyone with an internet connection. It had been mentioned briefly on the local radio station. Whether people read it or took it seriously was not her business. What she did with her own property in response to what she read was her business. Gerald Fitch came by on a Tuesday morning, carrying his coffee in the two-handed way that meant he had something on his mind. He stood at the fence and looked at the hawthorn, and then at the trees behind it, and then at Maya, with a look that had something careful in it. "You've been reading the winter forecast," he said. She looked at him. "Have you?" "My daughter sent me the long-range outlook. She lives in the city and worries." He was quiet a moment. "It says it could be the worst winter in 40 years. "It says it's possible," Maya said. "The models suggest probable. Are you worried?" She looked at her trees. "No." Gerald held his coffee with both hands and looked at the hedge. In the morning light, it had the dense, serious quality of something built rather than grown, which in a sense was true, because it had been as carefully constructed as any built thing she could have put up. "How much wind will those trees stop?" he asked. "At full growth, 50 to 60% on the north and west. Right now, at year 3, probably 40 to 45%. Still significant." He nodded. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "I've been thinking about putting in some trees on my north property line." "I can draw you a plan," she said. "It won't protect you this winter. Nothing you plant now will. But it would matter by year 3. He looked at her. "Would you?" "Yes," she said. She meant it. He went home. She went inside and opened a new sheet of graph paper and began sketching the rough layout for Gerald's property, noting in her margin that the orientation was different from hers. His north boundary was slightly angled, and the species selection would need to be adjusted for the heavier clay content she had observed in his soil when they had shared a trench for a utility line 3 years ago. She did this not because it was her job or because he had asked in any formal way, but because she knew how to do it and he needed it done. At the feed store, the forecast had arrived in the way news always arrived in Callaway Flats, through Ray Tolbert, who had printed it off and taped it to the counter beside the seed catalogs. People read it over the week, and the conversation in the store took on a different quality, a colder, more serious quality, a hardening of attention. Holt Pierce came in on a Thursday and read the printout and said nothing for a moment. Then he said, to no one in particular, that it was a forecast, not a certainty, and that in his experience, the weather people got it wrong at least half the time. Ray said that was probably true, but the long-range outlooks had gotten better in the past 20 years. Holt said he didn't put much stock in computers. He bought his supplies and left. At home, alone in his truck in his own driveway, Holt sat for a moment. He sat the way a man sits when he is running a mental calculation and not quite arriving at the answer he expected. He looked out the windshield at his open north pasture. He looked at the single cottonwood. He looked at the split-rail fence along his property line that would offer nothing at all against 70-mile-an-hour winds. He did not look in the direction of Maya's property. He did not need to look. He already knew what was over there. He had been driving past it 2 or 3 times a week for 3 years. He had watched it grow from sticks to what it was now, and what it was now, and this was the thing that had been sitting in the back of his thinking for months without him giving it full permission to be there. What it was now was the best protected property in the entire flat of the valley. The woman he had called an eccentric, the woman he had laughed at from his truck window, the woman whose trees Dale Morrow had said looked like weeds, had been building a fortress this whole time. Not with walls, with trees. 3 concentric rings of trees that were now, by anyone's assessment, significant. Dense, functional, ready. He did not say any of this out loud. He went inside and told Donna the forecast was probably overblown. She raised an eyebrow at him but did not push it. Maya did not know about Holt's private moment in his driveway. She would not have been particularly moved by it if she had. She was busy with the last of her autumn preparations, checking the mulch depth around the base of each tree, making sure the root zones were protected against deep frost, recording her final measurements of the season. The sky in October had the look of a sky that was loading up, not threatening exactly, but present in a way that October skies in this valley sometimes got: heavy, bright, with a cold light that made the yellow of the cottonwood leaves across the flat look too vivid, the way color sometimes gets intense just before the light goes. She had seen this look before in autumn skies. She had learned to read it. She closed her notebook and stood in the yard and looked up. The trees around her, her trees, the ones she had put in the ground 3 springs ago while Holt Pierce laughed from his truck window, swayed in the cold, easy way of trees that are rooted deep and holding. Winter was coming. The real one this time. The one she had been ready for since before anyone else in the valley had thought to wonder. She was not afraid of it. She was, in some quiet way she would not have described to anyone, waiting for it. May Braddock, when she read the forecast, her granddaughter had printed it for her and driven it out, because May did not own a computer and was not interested in starting, sat at her kitchen table for 20 minutes, and then went outside and looked at her own property with new eyes. Her hedgerow at the back of the garden was old and solid. Her fruit trees had the shelter of the house on the west side. But the east end of her property was open, and her greenhouse, which she had added 10 years ago, stood exposed on that end, in a way that had always been a small worry in bad winters. She came to Maya's fence on a Thursday morning and said she had read the forecast. Maya said she had too. May said, "My greenhouse." Maya said, "How far from the east boundary?" May said 12 feet. Maya thought about it. She said that May had two options. The first was a fast-growing temporary windbreak. She could plant a row of hybrid poplar along the east boundary, which would give significant protection within 2 years but was not a permanent solution, and would eventually need managing for root spread. The second was a compact conifer, planting closer to the greenhouse itself, which was slower but better long-term, and would not cause root problems near the structure. May said, "Which would you do?" Maya said she would do the conifers, starting now, and put a burlap screen on the east side of the greenhouse for this coming winter, as a bridge measure, while the trees established themselves. May said that was sensible. She said she would order the trees that week, and could Maya help her place them. Maya said yes. They spent the following Saturday planting 6 compact columnar conifers on the east side of May's greenhouse, working together in the way of 2 people who are each competent and have enough respect for the other's competence to distribute the work without discussing it. May prepared the soil. Maya placed the stakes at the measured intervals. They each planted 3 trees, alternating, and when it was done, Maya helped May string the burlap frame on a simple post structure on the outer side, while the trees established themselves. May stood back and looked at it. She said, "It's not much yet." "It's a start," Maya said. "By next autumn, those 6 will be 4 feet. By year 3, they'll be giving you real protection." May said, "I won't be worrying about 3 years from now. I'll be worrying about this winter." Maya said, "The burlap will hold through this winter, and those 6 trees will be here for whoever comes after you." May looked at her with the direct, unhurried look she used for assessments. "That's a good way to think about it," she said. They cleaned up the tools. May made tea, and they sat on May's porch with the cups, and looked at the conifer row, and the burlap screen, and the greenhouse behind them. The afternoon was cool, but not yet cold, in the way that the deep autumn would bring. May said, "When I planted my hawthorn hedge 30 years ago, the man at the nursery told me it would be 15 years before it was worth anything. I told him I planned to be here in 15 years. She looked at her tea. He was right, and so was I. Maya said nothing. She drank her tea. "People here didn't think you'd stay," May said. "When you first came, they thought you'd be here 2 years and go back to wherever you came from." Maya looked at the 6 young conifers in their row. "Did you think that?" May was quiet for a moment. "No," she said. "I thought you were someone who plants things. People who plant things stay." That was what she meant. It was the oldest and most reliable indicator of commitment to a place that May Braddock knew. Whether you put something in the ground that you intend to be there to see grow. Maya had put in 58 trees and 104 hawthorn starts and 4 willow whips in the gap. She had staked her future to this flat valley floor, as surely as any root system stakes itself to the ground it goes into. She finished her tea. She looked at the late October sky above May's property and felt the first real edge of the coming season in the air. In 2 months, maybe less, the valley was going to find out what a winter could be. And on the eastern flat, behind a ring of trees that had been growing for 3 years and were ready, her cabin was waiting for whatever the sky sent down. The storm did not arrive the way storms in movies arrive, with a single dramatic night and a morning of aftermath. This storm arrived the way the worst ones do, in stages, each one a degree worse than the one before, so that by the time people understood they were in the middle of something serious, they were already deep inside it. The first day brought snow, heavy, steady, the kind that accumulates fast and keeps its depth, because the temperature was already low enough to prevent settling. 8 inches by nightfall. Maya checked her animals in the early evening, and filled the feed bins, and made sure the water heaters in the troughs were working, then went inside, and started the stove, and made soup, and sat at the kitchen window, and watched the snow come down. The wind was light that first evening. She knew it would not stay light. The second day the temperature dropped. The snow stopped falling, but the sky stayed the particular gray-white of a winter sky that is not done yet, and by afternoon the wind had picked up from the northwest. She went out in the early afternoon and walked the perimeter and checked each tree. The inner ring of balsam fir was already showing its value. Inside the tree rings, the snow was settling evenly. Outside, on the open ground of her driveway and the road, the wind was already beginning to move it in drifts. The hawthorn held its ground along the fence with a solidity that pleased her. The thorn stems were catching and holding the blowing snow in a way that was forming a dense white wall along the fence line, the snow itself becoming part of the barrier. She checked her thermometer on the north wall of the cabin. She checked her anemometer. She went inside and wrote the readings in her notebook. Then she checked her firewood supply, confirmed the generator had fuel, and made sure the backup heating cable on the well casing was functioning. All of it was fine. She had been through this checklist twice already in November in preparation. She went through it again because being sure was better than being confident. On the third day, the front arrived. It came down off the ridge in the early hours of the morning, around 3, and it came with the full force of what the forecast had been trying to describe. The temperature was -22 Fahrenheit, with a wind chill that put the real cold somewhere in the -40s. The wind velocity, which Maya measured every 2 hours through the night, was hitting peaks above 70 miles per hour on the exposed flat to the west and north. She could hear it in the way buildings tell you about the weather outside, the low-frequency pressure changes, the flexing of the walls in the gusts, the sound in the chimney when a particularly strong wave of wind pushed across the roof. But her cabin was not flexing the way it had in the first winter, before the trees. She noticed this almost immediately. The walls were steady. The windows, which had rattled in strong winds before the tree rings were established, were quiet now. The stove was holding temperature without being pushed hard, which told her the infiltration, the cold air sneaking in through gaps, was far less than it would have been without the windbreak working outside. She went out at first light, which was a little after 7. The wind hit her immediately when she opened the cabin door, but it hit her at a fraction of the force she could see it delivering 50 feet away, in the open ground beyond her fence line. She pulled her hat down and walked the perimeter in the dim gray morning light. The trees were extraordinary. The hawthorn along the north and west fence had become something in the night. The snow driven against it from the outside had packed into and around the dense branches, until the outer face of the hedge was a solid white wall, the snow compressing and hardening in the sub-zero temperature into something that barely differed from a built structure. Behind it, the middle ring of pine and cedar stood solid, their branches heavy with snow but not bending to the point of damage. She had chosen species with the right branch flexibility for this kind of load. The inner ring of balsam fir stood in the relative calm of the protected space, their snow loads lighter, because so much of what was falling and blowing was being intercepted by the outer rings before it reached them. Inside the ring, the air was not still. She could feel the wind as a presence, a cold pressure, but it was reduced. The reduction was not subtle. It was the difference between standing in a wind that wants to take you off your feet and standing in a wind that is merely cold and assertive. She stayed outside for 20 minutes, checking each tree, looking for damage, finding none that mattered. 2 branches in the middle ring had come down under snow load, which was expected and negligible. The hawthorn was intact. The balsam fir were intact. She went back inside and made a pot of coffee and recorded her anemometer readings and sat down at the kitchen table. Outside the cabin, on the flat of the valley, the storm was doing what storms like this do to exposed ground. She could not see it clearly, because the visibility was down to a few hundred feet, but she knew the physics of it. In the open, with no barrier to slow or break it, wind at these velocities and temperatures was a genuine danger to animals, to structures, to any system that relied on warmth or shelter. The cold at this velocity did not feel like ordinary cold. It was the kind of cold that found every gap, every imperfect seal, every missing degree of insulation, and amplified them. She thought about Holt Pierce's north pasture. She thought about his split-rail fence. She did not feel satisfaction at this. She felt something more like concern, the ordinary human concern for other people in bad weather, regardless of what those people thought of you. She was warm. She was safe. She had food and fuel and water. Other people in this valley, People whose properties were fully exposed to what was happening outside might not be doing as well. This proved to be true, and she began to find out how true on the fourth day. Holt's son-in-law Dale Morrow called Gerald Fitch because Gerald's wife had the phone numbers for everybody on their road. Gerald came to Maya's door at 10 in the morning with his hat covered in snow, and his face doing something she had not seen it do before, something tight and serious. He said that Dale had told him the pipe at the back of the Pierce house had burst overnight. The heating system was struggling against the cold, infiltrating through the north-facing walls, and the pipes in the utility room had dropped below freezing somewhere in the night. The Pierce family was managing, but the house was cold, and they were burning through their firewood faster than expected. He said this matter-of-factly, but his eyes were watching her to see how she received it. She put on her coat and her boots. She told Gerald to call Dale and tell him she had spare heating cable he could use to wrap the remaining exposed pipes, and she had a propane space heater they could borrow to stabilize the utility room temperature. Gerald said Holt and Donna, their daughter Faye, and Faye's husband Dale, and their two youngest children, who were 7 and 9. She loaded what she had into the back of her truck and drove through the blowing snow to the Pierce property. She had not been inside their house before. She did not say this, and Holt did not say it either. He met her at the door and looked at what she had in the back of her truck, and something crossed his face that she did not look at too closely, because it was private. He said, "Come in," and she came in. The house was cold in the way she had expected. Not dangerously cold, but the cold of a building that is losing the fight for its warmth. The kind of cold you feel in the walls and the floor, more than in the air. Donna was at the kitchen stove keeping a big pot of water hot, which was practical. The two children were on the living room sofa under several blankets, with a dog between them. They looked at Maya with the curious, unconcerned eyes of children who have not yet decided whether the situation is serious. She went to the utility room with Holt and assessed the situation. She wrapped the two exposed sections of pipe with the heating cable and showed Holt how to test whether it was working. She set up the space heater and showed him the safe clearance distances and the correct setting for maintaining temperature without overloading it. She looked at the north wall and identified where the worst cold infiltration was coming in, a section near the floor where the exterior siding had a gap that was pulling in outside air, and she told him what he needed to seal it and said she had the materials in her truck if he wanted her to do it now. He said yes. She did it. She was there for 2 hours. When she was ready to leave, Donna stopped her in the kitchen and asked her to sit down and have something hot. She sat down. Donna made tea and set a plate of food in front of her without asking whether she wanted it, and the two of them sat at the kitchen table. Donna said, "How is your cabin holding up in this?" "Well," Maya said, "the trees have made a large difference." Donna looked at her for a moment. She had the particular look of a woman who has spent 30 years watching someone she loves be wrong about things, and has learned to recognize the exact texture of that wrongness when it is finally undeniable. "Holt wants to tell you something," she said. "He's working up to it." Maya said nothing. "He might need another day," Donna said. "He can take as long as he needs," Maya said. She drove home through the storm, with her heater on full, and her wipers working hard against the blowing snow. The road was drifted but passable. Her truck had good tires, and she knew the road. She turned onto her property lane, and her headlights caught the hawthorn hedge at the front fence, solid and white, and exactly where it was supposed to be. She parked and went inside. She pulled off her coat and her boots and stood in the kitchen for a moment. The cabin was warm, not the struggling warmth of a building fighting the cold, but the settled, even warmth of a building that had already won that fight for the night. The stove was holding. The walls were quiet. The thermometer on the north wall read 48 degrees Fahrenheit outside, factoring in wind chill. Inside the stove room it was 68. She wrote down the readings. She wrote down everything she had done at the Pierce property. She heated soup. She ate it at the kitchen table looking at her planting map, which was still pinned to the wall above the table where she had put it 3 years ago. The pencil lines of the concentric rings neat and deliberate, each tree's position marked with a small dot. Outside, the storm was still running. It would run for another 7 days. It would be one of the longest sustained cold events this valley had seen in 4 decades. By the end of it, half a dozen families in Callaway Flats would have experienced some kind of system failure. Pipes, heating, power from downed lines, structures damaged by wind or snow load. The valley would spend 2 weeks assessing damage when it was over, and the accounting would be significant. Maya's property would show a different accounting. She would emerge from 11 days of the worst winter the region had seen in living memory, with no structural damage, no system failures, full water supply, and the same firewood surplus she had started with, because the trees she had planted 3 years ago had done exactly what she had always known they would do. But that accounting would come later. Tonight, inside the warm cabin, at the center of her rings of trees, she finished her soup and cleaned her bowl and went to bed while the storm pressed itself against the outer hedge and met the response it deserved, something rooted and steady and built to last. On the 7th day of the storm, May Braddock's granddaughter called Maya's phone. Her name was Lily, and she was 24, and was calling from the city, worried, because she could not reach her grandmother by phone, and the roads in and out of the valley had been closed for 2 days, and she had no way of knowing whether May was safe. Maya put on her coat. She drove the half-mile to May's property in her truck with the 4-wheel drive engaged, pushing through the drift that had built across the road at the low point. She knocked on May's door, and May opened it in the coat she wore indoors, which told Maya the inside temperature was lower than it should be, but May's face was calm, and she did not seem distressed. The furnace was working but struggling. May's east end, where the greenhouse was, had a cold seep coming through the wall joint that was pulling the temperature down in the kitchen. The burlap screen had held, and the 6 young conifers behind it were fine. Maya checked them before she came inside, but the house itself needed more heat on the windward side. She called Lily from May's kitchen and told her May was fine, the house was manageable, and she would check back in the morning. She moved May's kitchen table closer to the stove, which was gas and working at full capacity. She sat with May for an hour and drank tea and listened to May talk about the winter of 1982, which had been, until this one, the worst in her memory. She had been 51 then, and her husband had still been alive, and they had managed it together, with a wood stove and stubbornness. Maya listened to all of this and did not say much, because the story was May's, and it needed to be told. She went back twice over the next 3 days to check on May, and each time May answered the door in the same indoor coat with the same calm expression, and each time Maya stayed for tea and left reassured. On the 3rd visit, May's kitchen was warmer. She had found another electric space heater in a back closet, the kind that had belonged to her husband and had been there for 30 years without being needed. She had set it up on the east side of the kitchen, and it was making the difference. May said, "I should have checked that closet before the storm." Maya said, "You know for next time." May said, "There may not be a next time, not at my age." Maya said, "The conifers will be 4 feet by next autumn. The time after this, you won't need the space heater." May looked at her with the precise, evaluating look. "You think very far ahead." "The trees require it," Maya said. May nodded. She poured more tea. Outside, through the kitchen window, the storm was still running, but lighter now, beginning to show the first signs of what the models had been suggesting for 2 days, that the blocking pattern was weakening, that the worst of it was behind them. Maya drove home on the half-cleared road, with the last of the evening light coming sideways across the snow. She turned into her property lane, and the headlights caught her hawthorn hedge, solid as a wall, and she pulled up to the cabin and sat for a moment before getting out. 8 people in the cabin. May checked and safe a half-mile away. Gerald's property secure. The trees doing exactly what she had designed them to do. The storm was not done, but it was tiring, and the ground it had been pushing against, her ground, her trees, her work, had not moved an inch. By the 5th day of the storm, Maya's cabin had become something she had not planned for it to become. It had not happened all at once. It had happened the way most things in her life happened, gradually, through a series of small practical decisions that accumulated into something larger than any one of them suggested. It began with Holt's grandchildren and ended, by the end of that week, with 6 adults and 2 children sitting in her living room, while the wind drove snow against the outer hedge, with a sound like the sustained rushing of water. The grandchildren came first. Holt had appeared at her tree gate on the afternoon of the 4th day, hunched against the wind, his collar up. She had seen him from the kitchen window before he knocked, and she had already put the kettle on, because there was only one reason a man like Holt Pierce would walk through this weather to her door. He said the house was manageable now. The pipes were holding with the cable. The space heater was doing its job. But the 2 children, his grandchildren, Faye and Dale's kids, 7-year-old Nell and 9-year-old Owen, were were going stir-crazy in a cold, stressed house, with 4 adults who were all working hard to keep things functioning, and nobody with the time or energy to keep 2 young children occupied and calm. He did not ask her directly. He said it in the way men like Holt said things they found difficult to say directly, by describing the situation in enough detail that the only possible response was the one he needed. He stood at her door in the wind and told her about the children, and waited. She opened the door wider and said, "Bring them over." Nell and Owen arrived 20 minutes later with Faye, carrying a bag that held 2 books, a deck of cards, and a stuffed animal that Owen was clearly too old to still be attached to, and equally clearly still attached to. They came inside and stopped in the hallway and looked at the cabin the way children look at a place they have never been before, taking it in with the unself-conscious inventory that adults have learned to disguise. "It's warm," Nell said. "Yes," Maya said. "Our house isn't warm right now," Owen said. "I know," Maya said. "It will be. Your grandfather is working on it." She made hot chocolate. She found a board game on the shelf she had owned since before she moved here, and never played, because she lived alone. She sat at the kitchen table with the 2 children and played the game, while Faye sat on the sofa and called her husband to confirm arrangements, and then sat quietly with the particular exhausted relief of a parent who has found a safe harbor for her children, and can, for 1 hour, stop problem-solving. Outside, the wind drove against the hawthorn hedge with a force that would have rattled the windows of an unprotected building. Inside the cabin, there was no rattling. The children played their game. The stove ticked. The kettle was available. On the 6th day, the 2 elderly sisters from the south end of the road arrived. Their names were Ruth and Clara Hanby, 71 and 73 years old, who had lived in the same house on the South Road for their entire adult lives, and had outlasted 3 decades of Callaway Flats winters without ever needing to leave. Their furnace had stopped during the night, a part failure that could not be repaired in current conditions, and their backup heating was a fireplace that was having difficulty drawing because the wind was pushing back down the chimney. Gerald Fitch had checked on them that morning and found them in coats inside their house, with the room temperature at 41 degrees, which at their ages and in these conditions was not safe. Gerald had called Maya because he did not have room himself. His guest room was being used for storage in a way that would take days to clear. Maya said, "Bring them." Ruth and Clara arrived with the precise, dignified composure of women who had decided long ago that difficulty was not an excuse for disorder. They thanked Maya for the invitation, wiped their boots carefully at the door, and sat on the sofa with their coats off within 5 minutes, as though they had always intended to visit. Clara immediately noticed the board game on the kitchen table and asked the children if they had room for 2 more players. They did. Maya set up the 2 cots she had in the back storage room. She had never used both of them at the same time. She had owned them since the reforestation project, where the team had kept cots for the field camp, and she had kept them for reasons she had not examined too closely until now. The young family arrived on the 7th day. Their name was Colton, Marcus and Beth Colton, in their early 30s, with a 14-month-old baby named Iris, who had the round, serious look of a baby that is watching everything. Marcus had tried to keep their pipes going with 2 space heaters, but a section of water line in their crawl space had been exposed to direct wind through a gap in the foundation skirt, and had frozen solid at some point during the 5th night. Without water, with a baby, in conditions that were still severe, they had done what the situation required. They appeared at Maya's gate in the morning with a bag and a car seat carrier, and the look of people who have stopped being embarrassed about needing help. She put them in the back bedroom. She dragged the old wooden crib from the storage room, the same storage room that now held the 2 cots, and assembled it in the corner. She did not wonder about the crib. She had inherited it along with the cabin's contents from the previous owner, an old woman who had grown up in the house, and it was simply there, and now it was useful. By the evening of the 7th day, Maya's cabin held 8 people: herself, Faye Pierce, Nell and Owen, Ruth and Clara Hanby, Marcus and Beth Colton, and baby Iris. The living room was rearranged around the stove, with every available blanket distributed and the furniture pushed back to make floor space. The kitchen was a continuous operation. Someone was always making something hot. Someone was always washing up. Someone was always filling a cup or a plate. The baby moved between arms. The children played with every game Maya owned. Ruth Hanby turned out to be an exceptional card player who had been hiding this from the children and then revealed it at a moment calculated for maximum effect. Everyone laughed. Maya moved through all of it with the same quality she brought to everything. Focused, practical, unflurried. She managed the stove so it held temperature without burning too much wood. She rotated people through the warmest spots when they needed it. She kept track of who had eaten and who had not. She was not a natural hostess in the performed sense of the word. She did not have the warm social performance that people sometimes expect in such situations. But she was thoroughly competent and quietly attentive, and this, in the end, was more valuable. At no point during any of this did she say a single word about her trees. Not to Faye, who owed her family's comfort in large part to the heating cable Maya had installed 4 days ago. Not to Ruth and Clara, who sat warm and dry in a cabin that had lost almost nothing to the worst storm in 40 years. Not to Marcus Colton, who sat by the stove with Iris on his knee and said, at some point on the 8th evening, that it was remarkable how quiet the wind sounded from inside this place, like it was coming from somewhere far away. Maya had simply said, "The trees help." That was all she said. 3 words. She could have said more. She could have explained the 3-ring shelter belt design, the species selection, the setbacks, the ground-level wind sealing she had achieved with the balsam fir, the turbulence reduction she had accomplished in the corridor between the hedge and the first ring. She could have said that she had designed this installation from first principles, based on 3 seasons of field experience and 2 winters of research, and that every person in this room was warmer and safer because of decisions she had made, while Holt Pierce laughed from the road. She said none of this. She said, "The trees help." Holt Pierce himself came on the 9th day, not with his grandchildren, not with a problem to fix, and not in the self-sufficient, arms-folded posture she had come to think of as his natural stance. He came alone, in the late morning, and he knocked on the door properly, rather than calling from the gate. She opened the door. He was holding a pot of stew. It was the particular slightly too deliberate way of holding it that people have when they are carrying something as a peace offering, and are aware that it is a peace offering, and are committed to not naming it as such. "Donna made too much," he said. She stepped back from the door and let him in. The cabin was its usual organized state of 8 people managing together. Ruth Hanby was at the kitchen table with a cup of tea. The children were on the floor with a jigsaw puzzle. Beth Colton was nursing the baby in the corner chair. Faye was doing something on her phone by the window. Marcus was outside in the relative shelter of the windbreak checking on Maya's animals, because he had grown up on a farm and had offered that morning to take over that task. Holt took in all of it. He set the pot of stew on the kitchen counter. He looked at his grandchildren on the floor, healthy and occupied and warm, and something in his face shifted in a way she did not watch directly, because it was his to have privately. He turned to Maya. He said, "I drove past on the road before I came in. The north fence line." She waited. "That hedge," he said. He stopped and started again. "You can't see through it. At all. There's a wall of packed snow against the outside of it, and then the branches behind it, and then nothing gets through." He paused. "The wind on the road is something, and then you're inside your gate, and it stops." She looked at him steadily. She did not help him. "I said some things," he said. He was not a man who was built for this kind of sentence, and it showed in every word. "About the trees, when you were planting. I said they were sticks. I said you were wasting your money." Ruth Hanby, who had heard everything, looked at her tea with great interest. Maya said, "I know what you said. I was wrong," he said. 3 words for 3 words, fair enough. She said, "Thank you for the stew. Tell Donna it smells good." He nodded once. He put his hat back on. He said goodbye to his grandchildren, who barely looked up from the puzzle, and he went back out into the storm. She stood at the window and watched him walk back through the gate and along the fence line to the road, and she saw the moment when he passed from the protected air inside her property to the full force of what was happening on the open ground outside. The wind hit him, and he put his head down and walked into it, and she watched him go until the snow reduced him to a shape, and then to nothing. She turned back to the room. Ruth Hanby looked up from her tea. "Well," she said, with the particular tone of someone who has just seen something fair happen in the world. "That must have cost him something." "Probably," Maya said. She went back to the stove and checked the firewood level and decided it was fine, and put her hands in her pockets and stood for a moment in the warm center of everything she had built. Outside, the storm was beginning, very slowly, degree by degree, gust by gust, to lose its absolute certainty about itself. The models on her laptop showed the blocking patterns starting to weaken. Not today, not tomorrow. But the end of this thing was becoming visible, the way the end of hard things becomes visible when you have been through enough of them to recognize the signs. She was ready for it to be over. Not because it had been difficult. It had not been particularly difficult, not for her. But because she was ready to be alone again, in her cabin, in her ordinary quiet life, among her trees. She checked the stove one more time. She put another log in. She went back to the business of keeping 8 people warm. After Holt left, the cabin returned to its regular rhythm of 8 people managing together. But the atmosphere had changed in a way that was hard to name precisely. It was not that Holt's visit had been dramatic. It had not been. But in small communities, a man like Holt walking through a storm to the door of a woman he had spent 3 years dismissing, and the words that passed between them when he got there, these things moved through the social air the way a shift in barometric pressure moves through physical air. You could not point to it exactly, but you felt it. Faye was quiet for an hour after her father left. She sat by the window and looked out at the snow and did not appear to be looking at anything. Then she came to where Maya was doing something at the kitchen counter and said, "He's not a bad person." Maya said, "I know that." Faye said, "He just doesn't change easily." Maya said, "Most people don't." Faye said, "It took this." She gestured at the window, at the storm outside, at the warm cabin they were standing in. It took all of this to show him. Maya thought about that. She said, "Some things only become clear under pressure. That's not a flaw. That's just how understanding works sometimes." Faye looked at her with a look that had something complicated in it. The look of someone reassessing a relationship between 2 people they care about, finding that one of those people was more generous than the situation required, and the other was still catching up. She said, "You're not angry." Maya thought about it carefully. She said, "No." She meant it. She had considered this question at various points over the 3 years. Whether what she felt about the laughter and the mockery and the bet and the driving past slowly to look constituted anger. She had found, each time she examined it honestly, that it did not. What she had felt was something more like certainty. The certainty that she knew what she was doing, which made other people's doubt about it less relevant than it might otherwise have been. When you are genuinely certain about something, you can afford to let other people be wrong, because your certainty does not depend on their agreement. She had been certain about the trees. She had been certain from the planning stage, from the moment the first graph paper drawing had come together, and she had stood at her kitchen table looking at the concentric rings, and known, with the particular knowledge that comes from years of careful study applied to a specific problem, that this was right. That certainty had been sufficient. She had not needed Holt Pierce to share it. She had only needed him to stop arguing with it eventually. And he had. He had come through a storm with a pot of his wife's stew, and stood in her doorway, and said the words that cost him something, and that was enough. Ruth Hanby, from her place on the sofa with her tea, had called it fair. Maya thought that was exactly the right word. Not generous on his part, not magnanimous, just fair. The correct response to having been wrong for a long time, finally given. She went back to managing the stove. The fire needed another log, and the temperature in the room had dropped 1/2 degree in the past hour, and she wanted to hold it steady. She had 8 people to keep warm. She would do that first, and think about everything else later. The storm broke on the 11th day with the particular abruptness of long weather systems when they finally release. Not a gradual improvement, but a sudden shift, a change in the light, a wind that went from sustained to intermittent to quiet within a matter of hours. By noon on the 11th day, the sky had opened to a blue so sharp and cold it looked like glass, and the sun came down on the valley and turned the snow brilliant in a way that made people squint when they looked out their windows. Marcus Colton went outside and stood in the yard for a moment, just standing, as though he needed to confirm that the outside existed again. He came back in and said to Beth that they should try to go home today, check the damage, see what needed fixing. Beth agreed. They packed what they had brought and thanked Maya in the direct, sincere way that people thank someone when gratitude is the only accurate word for what they feel. Maya helped them carry things to their truck. Ruth and Clara Hanby left in the early afternoon, when Gerald Fitch came by to confirm their furnace had been repaired. A service technician had made it out on the first passable road. They shook Maya's hand with the two-handed grip of women who mean what they do with their hands, and Ruth said, simply, "You kept us well." Maya said she was glad they had come. She meant it. Faye took the children home. Nell, the 7-year-old, hugged Maya around the waist with the unself-conscious force of a child who has decided someone is trustworthy. Maya stood still and let herself be hugged. Owen, 9 years old and conducting himself with the seriousness of someone who has been through something and wants credit for it, shook her hand. This made her almost smile. Almost. By evening, the cabin was her own again. She walked through the rooms slowly, restoring order, washing linens, opening windows for 10 minutes to let the cold, clean air through. She stood in the center of the living room and felt the particular quality of a space that has held a lot of people and now holds only one, still warm, with what had been in it. She went outside and walked the perimeter in the late afternoon light. The snow was deep and undisturbed inside the tree rings, none of the wind-driven scour that had carved the open ground of the surrounding valley into ridge drifts. Her hawthorn along the outer fence was buried to its midpoint on the outside, where 11 days of driven snow had packed against it, but intact and unbroken on the inner face. She pushed through the gate and walked the outside of the fence to look at the north line. The effect was dramatic from the outside, in a way she had never fully seen before, because you could not see it properly while you were inside it. The driven snow had built against the outer face of the hawthorn in a wave, the way snow builds against a wall, and then stopped. On the other side of the fence, the ground was smooth. The wind had not reached it. On the open ground of the road, the surface snow had been scoured and redeposited in long ridges by the sustained winds. On her property, behind her trees, the snow lay as it had fallen. She stood outside the fence for a long time looking at this difference. The local newspaper, a weekly that served a 4-town area, sent a reporter named Carol Birch out on the 3rd day after the storm. Carol was 34, earnest, and had grown up 2 valleys over, and understood the landscape and the people in it well enough to ask the right questions. She had been covering the storm damage through the week and wanted to document the recovery. Someone at the County Agricultural Extension Office, Maya suspected Helen Croft, had mentioned the property on the eastern edge of Callaway Flats as something worth seeing. Carol Birch drove out and parked on the road and got out of her car and looked. She was a reporter. She could see things. What she saw was the contrast between the storm-battered landscape of the surrounding flat and the untouched quality of Maya's property inside its ring of trees. She took photographs. She took a lot of photographs, because the difference was one of those things that was easier to show than to explain. Then she knocked on Maya's gate. Maya came to the gate, and Carol introduced herself and asked if she could ask some questions. Maya said yes, and opened the gate, and they walked the perimeter together, while Carol asked and Maya answered. Not at length, but accurately. Carol asked how the idea had started. Maya told her about the first winter in the cabin, the wind against the walls, the decision to study the problem rather than accept it. Carol asked how long the trees had been in. 3 years this spring, Maya said. Carol asked whether she had expected the windbreak to perform this well in a storm of this severity. Maya said she had designed it for this severity, because this severity of winter was always possible in this valley, and you designed for the worst case, not the average case. Carol wrote this down carefully. She looked at the hawthorn. She looked at the inner rings of conifers. She looked at the cabin, solid and undamaged in the center. She asked Maya if she had known the storm was coming. Maya said she had read the forecast in October. She said the forecast was clear enough. Carol paused. Did you tell anyone? The forecast was public, Maya said, on the Weather Service website. I didn't have anything to add to what was already there. Carol looked at her with the particular look of a reporter who has found the real story inside the story she came to cover. She wrote something else in her notebook. She took more photographs of the fence line, the hawthorn, the comparison between inside and outside the property. She thanked Maya and drove away. The article ran the following Thursday. It was longer than most articles in the paper, with 4 photographs. The headline was not something Maya had been consulted about, and was more dramatic than she would have chosen herself, but the content was accurate. It described the design of the windbreak, quoted Peter from the State Forestry Department about the wind reduction percentages, described what the property had looked like during and after the storm, and mentioned that several families from the surrounding area had sheltered at the property during the worst 11 days. Helen Croft sent Maya a text message the morning the article ran. It said, "Well deserved." Ray Tolbert at the feed store printed the article and put it on the counter beside the window where the forecast had been taped in October. People read it over the course of that week. The conversation in the feed store changed register again. It had been amused, then uncertain, then quiet. And now it was something else, something that did not have a simple name, but was closest to the kind of reckoning that communities sometimes go through when they have been wrong about something for long enough that the wrongness has become a fact of its own. Holt Pierce came into the feed store on the Friday after the article ran. Ray had not taken the article down. Holt looked at it on the counter. He read it through, which took a minute. Then he paid for what he had come for, and went to the door and stopped and said, to the two other customers who were also in the store, she knew what she was doing. He said it in the tone of someone establishing a record, not apologizing to the room exactly, but correcting what had been said in that room over the past 3 years, setting the record in the direction of the truth. He left. The two other customers looked at each other. One of them was Dale Morrow, Holt's son-in-law, who had once said Maya's hawthorn looked like weeds. Dale looked at the article on the counter and looked at the door Holt had walked through, and then looked at the article again. He did not say anything, but he took the article off the counter and folded it and put it in his coat pocket and walked out. Gerald Fitch came by Maya's gate on the Saturday after the article ran. He was carrying coffee in the two-handed way again. She came out and accepted hers, and they stood at the fence and looked at the tree rings, which were catching the winter light in the particular way of dense conifers in snow, heavy with white on the upper branches, dark underneath, the whole thing looking more substantial than it had before the storm, as if the storm had confirmed something about the trees, that the trees had known about themselves all along. "The paper did a good piece," Gerald said. "It was accurate," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "People are talking." "I know." "Good talking," he said. "Not the other kind." She drank her coffee. The air was still cold, but the storm quality had gone out of it. The sky was clear, and the valley was white, and the ridge above was sharp against the blue. Gerald turned his cup in his hands. "Dale Morrow asked me this week whether you would look at his property. For trees." He paused. He was serious about it. "I know," she said. She had received a text from Dale 2 days ago, awkward and brief, asking if she did consultations. She had replied that she was glad to help, and would come by when the roads were clear. "Faye asked too," Gerald said. "And there were 2 people I don't know who called the extension office, asking about windbreaks after the article." Maya looked at the hawthorn. 3 years ago it had been sticks. Now it was a wall. Now it was the reason that 8 people had been warm and safe for 11 days, while the worst storm in 40 years ran itself out against the valley. Now it was in the newspaper. Now people were asking about it. She thought about Ruth, the old forester from the Ontario Project, who had told her once that a forest you make yourself is always more yours than a forest you find. She had understood that at the time, in the literal sense, the physical investment, the work of it. She understood it differently now. A thing you make yourself becomes yours, in a way that a thing you find never quite does. And when the thing you make proves itself, when the work holds up to the test of what the world puts against it, it holds up in a way that goes further than the practical. It holds up as the record of who you were when you made it, what you believed, what you were willing to do without anyone's help or approval. The trees she had planted were her record, and they were standing. She finished her coffee and handed Gerald the cup. She said she would bring the graph paper for his north line this week, before the next cold spell came in. He said thank you. He walked back to his yard and she watched him go, and then turned and looked at her property in the winter light. The hawthorn along the outer fence. The pine and cedar in the middle ring. The balsam fir in the inner ring. The cabin at the center, warm and intact, and exactly what she had always needed it to be. The valley was recovering around her, fences being repaired, pipes being fixed, structures assessed and patched. The work of after. She had done most of her after work already, because her before work had been thorough. She had a list of small tasks, a branch to clear here, a mulch layer to restore there, but nothing that could be called repair. The trees had held, the design had held. The years of work and study and patient tending had held, through 11 days of the kind of cold and wind that left marks on everything around it, and left her property for the most part unchanged. She went inside to get her graph paper. She had a north fence line to plan for Gerald, and she wanted to get the design right. She always wanted to get it right. That had never changed. May Braddock came to Maya's gate the day after the article ran. She had the newspaper folded under her arm, which meant her granddaughter Lily had brought it out from town. She stood at the gate in her canvas jacket and her indoor boots, which meant she had come quickly without planning to stay long, and she handed the newspaper to Maya over the fence post. Maya looked at the photographs first. Carol Birch had a good eye. The contrast between the inside and outside of the property came through in the images, with a clarity that even Maya found striking. You could see, in a single photograph, the swept and scoured surface of the road, and the smooth, undisturbed snow on her property inside the tree line. The difference was complete. The trees were not visible in that image. The camera angle had been from outside, looking along the fence, but their effect was everywhere. She folded the paper and handed it back to May. "Accurate," she said. "More than accurate," May said. She had a look on her face that was not entirely readable, but was in the general territory of satisfaction. Not for herself, but for the rightness of something. "People have been talking." "I've been hearing that," Maya said. "Good talking," May said. "The kind that has embarrassment in it." "Which is the most useful kind?" She paused. "A person who is embarrassed about being wrong is more careful about being wrong the next time." Maya thought about this. It was exactly the kind of observation May made. Practical, unsentimental, accurate about the way people actually worked. She said, "I hope so." May said, "The extension office called me, Helen Croft. She's going to include the photographs in their regional windbreak guide. She wants to list the species and the spacing and all of it as a model installation." Maya had not known this. Helen had not told her yet. She said, "That's good." May said, "It will help people in other valleys, not just here." She looked at the property. "Something you did for yourself turns out to be useful to other people. That happens with the best work." She went home. Maya stood at the gate for a moment after she left and thought about what May had said. Something you did for yourself turns out to be useful to other people. She had not planted these trees to teach anyone anything. She had not planted them to be in a newspaper or a regional guide, or to become a model installation at the extension office. She had planted them because her cabin was cold, and the wind came off the ridge, and she knew how to fix that problem. But knowledge, once applied well and visibly, rarely stays private. That was the nature of it. A good solution to a real problem was always going to propagate eventually, because the problem it solved was not unique to the person who first solved it. Other people in other valleys on other exposed properties had the same wind, and the same cold, and the same need for what she had built here. What she had figured out for herself was transferable, and it would travel now through the extension office guide, and through Carol Birch's article, and through the Saturday mornings at the fence line, where people like Dale Morrow and Dennis and Ann Farrell stood with their graph paper and learned what she knew. She had not planned for this. She had planned for the trees. The rest had grown from the trees the way the best things grow, not designed, but natural, following the logic of something planted well in the right conditions. She went inside to get the graph paper for Gerald. She had a fence line to plan and a nursery order to place, and the new season was coming fast. The valley was recovering, and the work was beginning again, and she was exactly where she was supposed to be. The first Saturday in March, Holt Pierce showed up at Maya's gate with a shovel. He had not called ahead. He had not sent a message through anyone. He arrived at 8:30 in the morning, alone, with a shovel over his shoulder and a pair of work gloves folded into the back pocket of his jeans, and he knocked on the gatepost with the handle of the shovel, in the particular way of a man who has made a decision and is committed to it before he has fully worked out the details. Maya had been up since 6. She was at the kitchen table with her graph paper and a cup of coffee and the plan she had been drawing for Gerald's north fence line, which she had revised 3 times in the past 2 weeks, because she kept finding a better way to handle the angle where Gerald's property narrowed at the northwest corner. She heard the knock and looked out the window and saw Holt standing at her gate with a shovel, and she was quiet for a moment. Then she put on her coat and went out. He looked at her in the way of someone who has practiced what they are going to say, and then decided not to say it, and is now working from whatever comes naturally. "I want to put trees in on the north side of my property," he said. "Will you help me?" She looked at the shovel. She looked at him. She said, yes. She went back inside and put on her work boots. She brought her notebook and her measuring tape and her compass. She brought the graph paper and the pen she was using. She came back out and they walked together through the gate and down the road to the Pierce property, which was a 10-minute walk on a clear morning, and they walked it mostly in silence, which was the right kind of silence for two people who do not have the same history with words that they have with work. Holt's north property line was 230 feet long, running east to west across the full width of the field that took the hardest hit from the winter wind. The ground had thawed enough on the surface to be workable, though it went solid again below about 4 inches. She walked the line 3 times, checking the compass bearing, looking at the way the ground fell slightly toward the drainage channel on the east side, noting the soil type where she kicked down through the surface with her boot heel. She made notes. She drew the line on her graph paper. She stood at the fence and looked at the ridge to the north and identified the exact direction the worst wind came from, based on the drift pattern the storm had left on Holt's ground. You could read the winter wind in the snow, if you knew how. She said, you want 3 layers minimum. Outer hedge, middle mixed, inner conifer. He said he understood. She said hawthorn, for the outer hedge, same as hers, because it was right for the climate and the soil and the purpose. She said white spruce and balsam fir for the inner ring, but given the length of his line she would also mix in some tamarack, which was not in her own installation, but which would work well for the gap zone on the east end, where the drainage channel brought extra moisture. She said green ash for the middle ring, which was faster growing than cedar on his soil type. He wrote none of this down. He was watching her face while she talked, in the way of someone learning something by watching the person who knows it, not just by hearing the words. She noticed this. She did not say anything about it. She said she would order the materials from the same nursery she had used, and she would supervise the planting, because it needed to be done right or it would not be right. She said he would need soil amendments. She would provide a list. She said the spacing had to be precise, particularly on the hawthorn, because the density of the eventual hedge depended on the early spacing, and you could not correct it later without enormous effort. He said he understood. She said, you're going to do this right or not at all? He looked at her. He said, I'm going to do it right. She believed him. She had not expected to, 3 years ago, but she had learned, in the time since she had watched him drive past her property and laugh at her sticks, that Holt Pierce was not a man without substance. He was a man who had been certain for a long time, and certainty, when it meets something it cannot dismiss, does one of 2 things. It either digs in further and becomes rigid, or it turns, slowly, and becomes the foundation of something better than it was before. His was turning. By mid-March, the word had traveled through Callaway Flats in the specific way that practical information travels through communities that live by the land, not as gossip, but as knowledge. Maya Reese was putting in a windbreak on the Pierce property and taking consultations on others. People who had questions came to her directly or called the extension office and asked Helen Croft, who began directing them to Maya, with a small professional satisfaction that she was too experienced to express too openly, but that came through in the way she gave people Maya's number. Dale Morrow was the first after Holt. He drove out on a clear Saturday with a similar shovel-over-the-shoulder energy, though Dale added a case of coffee, good coffee, from the city, which he set on Maya's porch step without comment. She accepted it. They walked his north and west lines, and she drew the plan, while he watched, and she explained every decision as she made it. Why this species here? Why this spacing? Why the inner ring needs to be this far back from the fence and not closer? Dale listened with complete attention. He asked good questions, practical questions, the kind that told her he was actually thinking about what she was saying, rather than simply receiving it. She answered each one. By the end of the morning, he had a plan on paper that she had drawn and he had followed, and when she gave it to him, he held it with the careful respect that people give to things that matter. He looked at the plan, and then at her, and said, I said your trees look like weeds. She said, I know. He said, they didn't look like weeds for very long. She said, no, they didn't. They shook hands. He took his plan home. The 2 people who had called the extension office after the newspaper article were a couple, Dennis and Ann Farrell, who had a small hobby farm on the western edge of the valley, and had spent the storm in a house whose west-facing rooms had dropped to a temperature that frightened them. They came together, which she appreciated. It meant they were approaching it as a shared decision, which made the follow-through more likely. She walked their western boundary and explained the same principles she had explained to everyone else: layers, species, setbacks, density, time. Anne asked how long before it would make a real difference. Maya said 3 years for the beginning of it, 5 years for the full effect. She said that might sound like a long time, but the winter they had just lived through would come again. And when it did, 3 years from now, the trees they planted this spring would be doing something. Not everything, not yet, but something. Anne said something that Maya would think about afterward. She said, "You started planting when the weather was easy, because you knew the hard weather was coming." Maya looked at her. "I started planting because hard weather always comes eventually," she said. "You don't wait for it. You prepare for it when you have the time to do it properly." Dennis, who had been quiet through most of the walk, said, "That's what we should all have been doing." Maya said, "Now you will be." She meant it as a practical statement, but it landed as something slightly larger, and nobody said anything for a moment. The Saturday mornings began to have a different character in the weeks that followed. It started with Holt and Dale and the Farrells, and then it grew in the organic, unannounced way of things that make sense. A neighbor told a neighbor, someone at the feed store mentioned it. The extension office kept directing people out to the eastern edge of the flat. By April, Maya's Saturday mornings had become something she had not designed and could not have predicted. A kind of informal school, held outside, with muddy boots and graph paper, and the particular education that only comes from being shown something in the ground. She drew plans and explained her reasoning. She walked fence lines and identified exposures. She taught people the difference between a windbreak that works and one that looks good, but fails, because the species were wrong, or the spacing was off, or the designer didn't think about what happens at ground level when the wind gets under the canopy. She taught people to read the wind pattern in the drift patterns it left on snow, and to use that information to design a barrier that met the wind at its actual angle, rather than the angle you assumed it would come from. Gerald Fitch came to every one of these Saturdays, learning alongside people who had not paid him the attention he deserved over the years. He brought coffee, and stood at the back, and listened with the full, steady attention of a man who knows the value of good teaching. The community historian, a woman named Dorothy Pierce, who had been keeping the records of Callaway Flats for 30 years, in a series of handwritten journals she kept in the back of the post office, came out one Saturday with a notebook. She did not participate in the planting consultation. She sat on the fence post and watched and wrote. Occasionally she asked Maya a question, not about the trees, but about Maya, how long she had been in the valley, where she had lived before, what had brought her here. Maya answered without much detail, because her history was her own, and she was not given to sharing it broadly. But Dorothy was patient and specific in her questions, the way someone is patient and specific when they are constructing a record, and by the end of the morning, she had enough to write what she was going to write. What Dorothy wrote, in the community journal she had been keeping for 30 years, was 2 pages about Maya Reese and the trees on the eastern property. She wrote about the planting, and the mockery, and the 3 years of patient work, and the storm. She wrote about the 8 people who sheltered in the cabin for 11 days and emerged unhurt. She wrote about the consultations that had followed, the plans Maya had drawn for 6 properties in the valley, the Saturday mornings at the fence line. She wrote, near the end, that Maya Reese had arrived in Callaway Flats as an outsider, and had spent 6 years on the edge of a community that did not quite know what to make of her. She wrote that this had not seemed to concern Maya, and that in the end it did not need to, because Maya had known something the community had not known, and had acted on that knowledge with a consistency that the community eventually could not ignore. She wrote that a thing planted with patience and grown with care becomes, in time, impossible to dismiss. She kept this journal in the back of the post office, as she always did, and anyone in Callaway Flats who wanted to read it could. Maya did not read it. She did not know it had been written. She was busy. She had 6 plans to finalize, a nursery order to confirm, and the planting on Holt's north fence line to oversee, which was beginning the following weekend. She was also updating her own tree records for year 3, measuring the final winter heights and the early spring buds that were already beginning to show on the hawthorn. The hawthorn was magnificent this spring. That was the only word for it. In its 4th year, it had crossed the line between something growing and something established, and standing inside the gate, and looking at the outer fence line, you could no longer see through it in any direction. It was a hedge, fully realized, exactly what she had drawn on graph paper 4 winters ago as the thing it would become. She stood inside her gate one evening in late April, and looked at it. The inner ring of balsam fir stood behind her, their spring growth already pushing from the terminal buds, the whole tree alive with new green. The middle ring of pine was filling the space between the hedge and the inner trees, with a solidity that had surprised even her by how quickly it had come. The balsam held its low branches in the way she had always known it would, sealing the wind out from ground level to crown. She had built this, with her own hands, over 3 years, in a valley that had laughed at her while she did it. She was not angry about the laughter. She had never been angry about it. Anger would have made the project about them, and the project was never about them. It was about the ground, and the trees, and the wind, and the years, and about what a person can build when they understand something well enough to commit to it, without needing anyone to agree. The trees did not need anyone to agree with them. They simply grew. They grew because the conditions were right, and the species were right, and the work that had gone into them was right, and they would go on growing, long after the winter that had tested them had been catalogued in Dorothy Pierce's journal, and filed in the back of the post office. They would outlast the laughter. They were already outlasting it. The evening light came down across the valley, and caught the new growth on the hawthorn, in a way that made it look golden at the edges, and she stood in the yard and looked at it for a long time. Then she went inside and made tea, and sat at the kitchen table with a new sheet of graph paper, and began sketching the layout for the Farrell property, on the western edge of the valley, where the wind came hardest, and where 2 people, who had spent a winter that frightened them, were about to plant the first ring of what would, in 3 or 4 years, be something worth standing behind. She drew the line carefully. She marked the positions. She noted the species, the spacing, the setbacks, the soil amendments. She got it right. She always got it right. She had been getting it right in this valley for 6 years, quietly, without applause, in the kind of patient and specific way that eventually speaks for itself. Outside, the valley was coming back to life after its hard season. The snow was gone from the flat ground. The ridge above the property showed the dark green of its evergreen slopes, and the cottonwood by Holt's drainage ditch was putting out its first small leaves, pale and tentative in the way of first leaves. Everything was beginning again, and for the first time since she had arrived in Callaway Flats, Maya Reese was not doing it alone. Not because she had needed company all along. She had not. She had been complete in herself, and her work had been complete, and her knowledge had been sufficient. But because the people around her had finally, slowly, in the way that communities do when something makes its case through results rather than argument, come to understand what she had always been doing, and had decided that they wanted to be part of it. She drew the last line on the graph paper. She set the pen down. She picked up her tea. Outside, the spring evening settled over Callaway Flats, and the trees stood in their rings, rooted and alive, ready for whatever came next.